You step into the small stone workshop just as the last light of the day begins to drain from the sky beyond the high window slit. The wooden door, slightly warped by years of sea dampness, closes behind you with a soft, solid sound that separates the room from the street. Inside, the air is still and cool, holding a faint mixture of linseed oil, chalk dust, and old cypress wood, a smell so familiar that your shoulders drop without any conscious thought. The room is not large, just wide enough for a workbench, a stool, some shelves, and the slow passage of one person moving from wall to wall. Its lime-washed surfaces reflect the dim grey light in a way that makes the whole space feel like the inside of a quiet shell. You stand for a moment just inside the door, letting your eyes adjust. The bench sits against the far wall beneath the window, a heavy, unadorned thing of dark wood, its surface worn smooth by countless hours of work. Upon it rests a flat porphyry grinding slab, a collection of small clay pots with fitted lids, a tall glass jar half full of clarified oil, and a plain ceramic cup. A folded sheepskin covers the low stool, its wool dense and cream-colored, pressed flat from use. Nothing in the room is new, nothing is bright, and everything carries the gentle patina of slow time. Your first action is a slow one. You walk the 2 paces to the bench and reach for the clay oil lamp that sits at the far corner. It is a simple shape, a shallow bowl with a pinched spout for the wick, its surface glazed in a muted brown that darkens where fingers have held it over the years. You lift it with both hands, feeling the slight roughness of the ceramic, and set it in the center of the workspace. From a small stone jar beside it you pour a measure of olive oil, thick and golden clear, watching it pool around the base of the wick and soak upward into the twisted flax fibers. The smell of the oil rises, clean and faintly fruity, mixing with the older scents of the room. You take a flint and a small curved steel striker from a niche in the wall, the metal cool against your palm. Kneeling slightly so that your face is level with the lamp, you hold the striker over the wick and draw the flint across it with a single, unhurried motion. A tiny cluster of sparks scatters into the oil-soaked flax. One catches, and a small flame lifts into being with a soft hiss. You withdraw the striker and watch the fire settle, a trembling teardrop of gold and blue at its base that gradually steadies into a steady yellow point. It casts a warm, limited circle of light on the bench, leaving the corners of the room in deep brown shadow. You adjust the wick with a thin bronze pick, pushing it forward a hair's breadth so that the flame grows just enough to illuminate the grinding slab without smoking. The lamplight flickers only when a slight draught moves through the high window, and even then it rights itself quickly, returning to an almost perfect stillness. You remain there motionless for a long series of breaths. Outside, the city of Constantinople settles into its evening rhythm. The street beyond the fixed stone wall is a narrow lane that winds between workshops and houses, and the sounds that drift through the window slit are softened by distance and plaster. A vendor calls out once in a melodic fading tone, announcing the last of his day's goods, his voice trailing off into the general murmur of the neighborhood. Somewhere a wooden cart creaks over uneven paving stones, the sound of iron-rimmed wheels and the patient clopping of a donkey's hooves creating a slow repeating pattern that eventually turns a corner and disappears. A woman's voice, light and brief, exchanges a greeting with a neighbor, and then a door closes and the lane grows quieter still. You listen without effort, letting the sounds pass through your awareness like water through a sieve. You are not in a hurry. The night ahead is long and empty of any demands, and the work you will do with the pigments requires no urgency. The icon you are preparing, a panel of cypress wood coated in white gesso, will wait in perfect patience. There is no need to rush. You turn now to the workspace itself, moving with the same slow deliberateness. First you pick up the cup of water, a plain terracotta vessel with a small chip at the rim, and you carry it to the clay water jar that stands on the floor near the door. Lifting the jar's wooden lid, you dip the cup in and fill it to 2/3. Then replace the lid carefully so that no dust or insects fall into the supply. The water is cool, drawn from the cistern earlier in the day, and it smells faintly of stone. Earlier in the day, and it smells faintly of stone. You set the cup beside the grinding slab, positioning it so that it is within easy reach of your right hand, but far enough from the edge of the bench that you will not knock it over. Next, you take a moment to arrange the small clay pots. Each one is the size of a cupped palm, glazed inside to prevent the pigments from staining the porous clay, and each bears a small scratch mark on its lid to indicate its contents. You line them up in a row along the back of the bench, their rounded shapes casting tiny oval shadows in the lamplight. You do this without counting them, simply moving them from scattered positions into a straight line with the side of your hand, the soft ceramic making a gentle scraping sound against the wood. The lids fit snugly, and you press down on each one to ensure it is sealed, a habit born of long experience with fine powders that can drift away on the slightest breath of air. You also shift the glass jar of clarified oil so that it stands behind the pots, where it will not be accidentally tipped over. The oil inside is clear amber, thick and slow-moving when you tilt the jar slightly. You note the level with a glance, seeing that there is enough for many more nights of mixing binder, and you set it back down without comment. Now the sheepskin on the stool needs a small adjustment. You lift it, shake it once with a gentle, lazy motion that releases a few loose fibers into the lamplight, where they float like tiny pale moths. And then you fold it over again so that the thickest part cushions the front edge of the wooden seat. You sit down, settling your weight gradually, feeling the layers of wool and wood accept your body with a familiar, comfortable firmness. Your back rests against the cool plaster of the wall, the lime wash slightly chalky under your shoulder blades, and the contact is grounding. From this seated position, the workshop looks slightly different. The lamplight is now at the level of your chest, and it throws your own magnified shadow onto the opposite wall, a soft-edged silhouette that moves only when you move. You can see the texture of the lime wash more clearly now. Tiny trowel marks, fine cracks that branch like winter twigs, the faint unevenness of a surface applied by hand many decades before you ever entered this room. The high window slit is a rectangle of dark blue now, with the first faint stars beginning to prick through, though you do not look at them directly. Your attention remains on the bench in front of you, on the objects that wait there. Your breathing has slowed without your noticing. You feel the slight expansion and contraction of your ribs against the plaster, a rhythm that mimics the gentle, repetitive motion of the sea far below the city walls. In the distance, beyond the lane and the rooftops, the low, sustained note of the evening call to prayer begins to sound from a single voice, then another farther away, a layered tapestry of sound that spreads across the city and fades into the background like a tide. You sit through it without moving, letting the sound wash past you, and when it is done, the silence that follows seems deeper and more complete. You lean forward just enough to place both hands palm down on the wooden bench. The wood is smooth under your fingers, the grain polished by years of contact with skin and cloth, and the fine abrasive dust of ground minerals. You trace one of the grain lines with the tip of your index finger, a slow, absent movement that follows a dark, wandering curve across the width of the board. The line disappears under the grinding slab and emerges on the other side, and you follow it all the way to the edge, where it ends in a small knot like a closed eye. This simple, repetitive touch absorbs your attention completely, each second stretching out into a comfortable, quiet span of time. A small sound draws your notice, a faint creak from the roof beams above as the cooling air contracts the old timber. The sound is brief and harmless, and you do not look up. Instead, you turn your head slightly to observe the lamp flame. It is a little shorter now, and the oil level in the bowl has dropped by a sliver, so you make a mental note to refill it before you leave, hours from now. For the moment, it burns steadily, and that is all that matters. You shift your focus to the basket of raw mineral chunks that sits on the floor to your left, pushed against the leg of the bench. It is a shallow woven basket of split reed, its rim darkened from handling. Through the gaps in the weave you can see the irregular shapes of earth stones wrapped in scraps of linen, and you know that selecting the next piece to grind will be the first real step of tonight's work. But you do not reach for the basket yet. Instead, you simply look at it, observing the way the lamplight catches the rim and leaves the interior in darkness, the way the handle is tied with a strip of leather that has become shiny with age. Your mind drifts slightly, a slow, pleasant drift that does not attach itself to any particular thought. You might think about the panel of cypress wood waiting on the shelf behind you, already coated in white gesso and burnished to an ivory smoothness, but you do not dwell on it. You might think about the red ochre that you will grind tonight, a piece of earthstone that came from the hills near the Bosphorus, but the thought passes gently and dissolves. There is no pressure to plan, no need to organize a sequence of tasks. Everything will happen in its own time, one small action leading naturally to the next. You notice that your left shoulder carries a slight tightness, a remnant of the day's ordinary activities, so you roll it once, very slowly, feeling the muscles loosen. The lamplight flickers as your movement creates a tiny current of air, and then it steadies. You roll your shoulder a second time, even more slowly, and then you let it be. Your body settles deeper into the sheepskin, the dense wool cushioning your hip bones, and your spine finds a natural alignment against the wall that requires no effort to maintain. From somewhere in the neighborhood comes the brief, mellow sound of a flute, a few wandering notes that rise and fall without forming a melody. Perhaps someone practicing, perhaps just a neighbor amusing a child. The notes thread through the window slit, soft and rounded by distance, and they fade away after a handful of heartbeats, replaced by the more constant sound of the lamp's tiny hiss. The combination of the brief flute, the steady lamp, and the cool air coming through the window creates a moment of deep, suspended calm. You remain in this still, seated position for an extended stretch of time. Your eyelids lower slightly, not from sleepiness, but from a kind of resting alertness that makes the world appear softer and more unified. The lamplight becomes a pool of gentle amber, the shadows behind the pots, a velvety brown, the texture of the lime-washed wall, a field of subtle variations. You are not waiting for anything, not remembering anything, urgent. You are simply present, your hands resting loosely in your lap, your breathing slow and even, your body a quiet weight on the stool. After a while, you lift your right hand and place it once more on the wooden bench, this time nearer the grinding slab. The porphyry stone is cool to the touch, its surface polished by years of grinding to a glassy smoothness that reflects a tiny, distorted version of the lamp flame. You trace its edge with your fingertip, feeling the slight bevel where the stone was cut. The motion is repetitive and soothing, and you follow the rectangle's perimeter several times, each circuit identical to the last and requiring no conscious thought. Eventually, your hand comes to rest again. The city outside has grown even quieter now. The last donkey cart has long since passed, the vendors have closed their shutters, and the neighbors have retreated behind their own doors. The only steady sound is the faint, rhythmic pulse of crickets in a hidden courtyard, a sound so continuous and even that it becomes a kind of silence itself. The lamp burns on, the flame so still that it might be painted onto the air, and the pool of light beneath it is unwavering. You notice, with a kind of detached, gentle observation, that the scent of the room has changed slightly. The olive oil from the lamp adds a thin, warm note to the older background of chalk and wood, and the cool air coming through the window carries a faint salt tang from the sea. These layers of smell coexist without competing, each one present if you choose to notice it, each one receding if you do not. You are ready to begin the night's work, but you allow that readiness to sit quietly inside you, without pushing it toward action. You will reach for the basket of mineral chunks soon. You will unwrap the linen cloths and choose the stones that feel right for this particular night. You will pour a little water onto the grinding slab and begin the long, slow process of turning raw ochre into the soft, velvety paste that will one day become the red of a saint's robe. But for now, you are still in the threshold moment. The workshop at dusk, the lamp lit, the world hushed, your hands resting and your mind as calm as the surface of a pool, untouched by wind. The flame dips once, a tiny fluctuation so small that you almost miss it, and then it recovers. A thin line of smoke, invisible in the light, rises from the wick and disappears into the shadows near the ceiling. You watch the flame for a long series of breaths, observing the way the yellow part of the fire is surrounded by a faint blue envelope, the way the tip of the flame sometimes splits into two tiny tongues that dance independently before merging back together. The visual rhythm of the flame is hypnotic, and your mind follows it into a deeper state of quiet, a place where time moves like a slow, wide river. At last, with no sense of decision, you notice that your hand has moved to the edge of the basket beside you. Your fingers touch the woven reed, feeling the slight ridges and the smoothness where the reed has been worn, and you know that the next phase of the night is about to begin. But you do not lift the basket yet. You let your hand rest on its rim, and you allow the moment to stretch a little longer, because there is no hurry, no schedule, no demand. There is only the workshop at dusk, the steady lamp, and the slow, gentle promise of hours of quiet labor ahead. Your hand remains on the rim of the woven reed basket for a length of time that you do not measure. The lamplight continues its steady glow, the flame a small golden companion in the quiet, and the cool air from the window slit moves across the back of your neck with a gentleness that is barely there. When the moment feels naturally complete, you curl your fingers under the basket's rim and lift it from the floor with both hands, raising it onto the workbench beside the grinding slab. The basket is not heavy, its weight made up of small, dense things, and it settles onto the wood with a soft, rustling sound, like dried grasses stirring in a faint breeze. You position the basket so that it sits to the left of the porphyry slab, angled slightly toward the lamp to catch the most light. The woven reeds are a pale tan color, their surfaces smooth and slightly glossy where hands have held them over the years. The handle, a thicker loop of split reed, wrapped with a thin leather binding, lies flat against the side, and the interior of the basket is a jumble of linen cloths in muted whites and creams. Each cloth is wrapped around a single mineral chunk, the shapes irregular and lumpy, like small sleeping creatures nestled together in a nest of fabric. You lean forward just enough to bring your face closer to the basket, the lamplight warming your cheek, and you begin the slow process of selecting the first stone. Your fingers move among the wrapped bundles with a light, unhurried touch, feeling the different textures through the linen. Here a sharp edge, there a rounded curve, here a gritty surface that makes a faint scratching sound against the cloth. You do not pull anything out yet. You simply explore the contents by touch, learning the geography of the basket in the same way a person might run their hand over a familiar bookshelf in the dark. One shape in particular draws your attention, a slightly larger bundle that rests near the bottom, its form suggesting a stone with a broad, flat face. You work it free with careful fingers, loosening the surrounding bundles without disturbing them more than necessary, and you lift it out into the lamplight. The linen wrap is old and soft from many washings, its edges frayed into a fine fringe of threads that catch the light and glow like tiny filaments of silk. The cloth is tied with a simple slip knot of thin hemp twine, and you spend a moment examining the knot, noting how the fibers have stiffened slightly with age, their pale brown color contrasting with the white linen. You pull the end of the twine with a slow, steady pressure, and the knot loosens without resistance, the coils falling open one after another. The linen unfolds in your palm like a flower opening, revealing the stone inside. It is a lump of red ochre, dense and heavy for its size, its surface a deep brick-red color that seems to absorb the lamplight rather than reflect it. The stone is roughly the size of a hen's egg, somewhat flattened on one side, and its texture is fine-grained and slightly dusty to the touch. When you press your thumb against it, a faint smear of reddish powder transfers to your skin, like the bloom on a plum. You hold the ochre chunk up to the lamp, turning it slowly between your thumb and forefinger. The flame's light cannot penetrate the stone, but it plays across its surface in shifting highlights that reveal subtle variations in color. Some areas are a shade darker, closer to brown, while others carry a faint purplish undertone that speaks of iron-rich earth. There are tiny, glittering flecks embedded in the stone here and there, specks of silica that wink when the angle of the light is just right, and a thin vein of paler, yellowish material runs across one face like a scar. You rotate the stone several times, watching the light travel across its contours, memorizing its shape and its peculiarities. You set the red ochre down on the wooden bench to the right of the slab, placing it on the linen cloth like a jewel on a cushion. This one, you have decided, is ready for grinding. Its quality is good, its color deep, and its texture promises a fine, smooth pigment after the proper work. The decision is not a dramatic one, just a small quiet note of selection that you make in the back of your mind, and you turn back to the basket without any sense of accomplishment or excitement. The next bundle you lift out is smaller and more irregular, with corners that poke against the linen in sharp angles. The twine around this one is darker, almost brown, and it takes a moment longer to work the knot free because the fibers have become slightly tangled. You pick at the knot with patient fingernails, loosening one loop at a time, and the rhythmic, tiny movements are as calming as anything else in the room. When the cloth finally opens, it reveals a chunk of dark hematite, a stone so heavy and metallic-looking that it seems almost out of place among the softer earth minerals. The hematite is a silvery grey in colour, but its surface carries a darker blue-black patina that catches the light with a subdued, almost oily gleam. It is smooth in some places and rough in others, with a conchoidal fracture that looks like a frozen wave where a piece chipped off long ago. You run your thumb over the smooth face, feeling its cold, hard slickness, a texture entirely different from the dusty warmth of the ochre. The stone leaves no residue on your skin, and when you tap it gently against the wooden bench, it produces a faint, high-pitched click that hangs in the quiet air for a moment before fading. You hold the hematite up to the lamp, turning it in the same slow, methodical way you used with the ochre. The light slides across its surface without penetrating, creating a sharp line of brightness that defines its edges. You notice a subtle shimmer along one fracture plane, a metallic luster that hints at the iron within, and you think, without forming words, about how this stone will grind down into a dark, cool pigment suitable for shadows and outlines. You place the hematite on the bench beside the ochre, still on its unfolded cloth, and you note how the two stones look together, one warm and earthy, the other cool and mineral, a small collection of opposites. Your hand returns to the basket, the wicker creaking softly as you shift the remaining bundles to find the next piece. This time your fingers close around a shape that is soft-edged and slightly crumbly, the linen wrap feeling looser and less taut. You draw it out and untie the twine, which parts easily, and the cloth falls open to reveal a lump of yellow ochre that is paler and more friable than the red. The stone is the color of dry mustard, with a porous, chalky texture that sheds a fine yellow dust onto the linen as soon as you touch it. It is lighter in weight than the red ochre, and its surface is pitted with tiny holes like the surface of a sea sponge. You examine the yellow ochre with the same slow care, bringing it close to the lamp and turning it so that the light falls across its uneven surface. The color is warm and muted, a yellow that carries a hint of brown, like autumn leaves after they have fallen and dried. Along one edge there is a streak of brighter, almost orange material, and you make a mental note that this streak could be separated out or ground together with the rest, depending on the effect you want. The stone crumbles slightly at the edge when you press it with your nail, releasing a fine powder that drifts down onto the linen in a tiny, soft pile. You gather the loose grains with a fingertip and rub them between your thumb and finger, feeling their silky, dry texture like talc. You set the yellow ochre down with the others, arranging the three stones in a loose row on their cloths. The red, the dark hematite, and the yellow sit side by side, a triad of earth colors that hold within them the potential for flesh tones, shadows, and the warm highlights of a saint's robe. You look at them for a long, quiet moment, without any particular thought, just observing the way the lamplight pools around them and casts their small shadows onto the wood grain. There is one more piece to select, and you know which one it is even before your fingers find it. Near the very bottom of the basket, wrapped in a piece of linen that is slightly finer than the others, lies a chunk of green earth that came from a trader's shipment many months ago. You remember the day it arrived, not as a vivid memory, but as a faint, distant impression. The trader's voice in the street, the weight of the stone in your palm for the first time, the unusual coolness of its surface. You work it free carefully, lifting it out with both hands, because it is somewhat larger than the other stones. The linen around the green earth is finer and smoother, almost like a small piece of old bedsheet, and the twine is a clean, pale hemp. You untie it and fold the cloth back, revealing a stone the size of a flattened fist, with a color that is difficult to describe in simple terms. It is green, yes, but a green that is muted and grayish, the color of sage leaves that have been dried in the shade, or of lichen growing on a north-facing wall. The surface is smooth and almost soapy to the touch, with a cool, dense weight that speaks of clay minerals compressed over unimaginable time. You lift the green earth stone to the lamp, and as you turn it, you notice how the light seems to sink into its surface rather than bouncing off. The color deepens where the stone is damp from the air's humidity, a dark olive tone that looks rich and shadowy, while the drier areas remain a dusty, pale celadon. You run your thumb across the surface, feeling a slight waxy resistance, as if the stone has its own natural binder already mixed into it. The sensation is pleasant, slow, and calming, and you repeat the motion several times, each stroke identical to the last, until you feel that you have learned everything your skin can tell you about this particular piece of earth. You place the green earth on the bench beside the others, completing the row. Now 4 stones rest on their unfolded linen cloths, each one a distinct personality of color and texture. The red ochre glows with a low, warm intensity. The hematite gleams dark and secretive. The yellow ochre sits soft and dusty like a lump of powdered sunlight. And the green earth lies calm and cool, a fragment of a distant hillside brought into this small stone room by the sea. The lamplight plays across them all, shifting slightly whenever the flame flickers, and you sit back on your stool to look at the group as a whole. Your back finds the familiar support of the cool plaster wool, and your hands come to rest on your thighs, palms up, relaxed. The workshop is utterly silent now, except for the faintest whisper of the lamp and the distant, almost inaudible murmur of the city, which at this hour has become a single, low-frequency hum, like the sea heard from far inland. You breathe in the smell of the stones, a dry mineral scent that mingles with the oil lamp and the general dustiness of the room, and you let your gaze travel slowly from one stone to the next, observing without judging. The red ochre, you notice, has a small chip on one side that you did not see before. You lean forward to examine it more closely, picking the stone up and turning it so that the lamp catches the fresh surface inside the chip. The exposed material is a brighter, more vivid red than the weathered exterior, and you can see the fine, even grain of the stone in cross-section, like smooth clay that has been baked in the sun. You set it down again, satisfied that this imperfection will not affect the grinding. In fact, it may make the initial crushing a bit easier. The hematite draws your attention next. You pick it up and feel its weight, a surprising heft for such a small piece, and you tap it once more against the wood of the bench, listening to the short, clear note it produces. The sound is like a tiny bell made of stone, and it lingers in your ears for a brief second before being absorbed by the quiet. You run your fingertip along the sharp edge of the fracture, feeling its smooth, almost glossy quality, and then you set it down with a deliberate gentleness that makes no sound at all. The yellow ochre crumbles a bit more as you handle it, and you spend a short while collecting the loose particles with the side of your hand, sweeping them into a small pile on the linen cloth. The powder is a soft buttery yellow, finer than you expected, and it coats your skin in a thin, pale film. You rub your fingers together, feeling the dry, silky slide of the mineral dust, and you think, in a slow and dreamy way, about how many coats of this yellow will be needed to build up the gold background of an icon, each layer so thin that it takes a dozen applications to reach the proper radiance. The green earth stone remains cool no matter how long you hold it, as if it draws warmth from your hand and stores it somewhere deep inside its structure. You press it against your cheek for a brief, absent moment, feeling the smooth coolness against your skin, and the sensation is so pleasant and grounding that you hold it there for several breaths before returning it to its cloth. The stone leaves no residue, no stain, just a faint memory of temperature that fades slowly from your face. Now that all 4 stones are laid out and examined, you turn your attention to the linen cloths themselves. You smooth each one flat with your palm, pressing out the wrinkles and creases left by their long service as wrappers. The cloths are soft and thin, almost translucent in places where the threads have worn down, and they smell faintly of the stones they have protected, a mingled earth scent that rises subtly as you handle them. You fold each one into a neat square, tucking the twine inside so that it will not be lost, and you set the folded cloths aside at the back of the bench. They will be used again later, after the stones are ground and the pigment powders are stored, but for now they rest in a tidy stack, a small monument to preparation and order. The basket now sits empty on the bench, its interior dark and still, a few loose specks of mineral dust caught in the weave at the bottom. You tilt it toward the lamp to see these specks more clearly, a sprinkle of red, a sparkle of silver grey, a dusting of yellow, a trace of green. Together they form a tiny, accidental mosaic that you look at for a moment before you turn the basket upside down and tap it gently with your knuckles. The dust falls onto the bench in a fine, multicolored sprinkle, and you sweep it into your palm and carry it the short distance to the high window slit, where you let it drift out into the night air. The specks catch the lamplight for a single brief instant, a miniature constellation of color, and then they are gone. You return to your stool and sit down again, settling your weight onto the sheepskin, which has molded itself to your shape by now. The 4 stones are arrayed before you, waiting, and the night has grown deep and still around the workshop. You know that the next step will be to wash these stones and prepare them for the grinding slab, but you do not move to do so immediately. Instead, you allow yourself another long, quiet pause, your hands resting loosely in your lap, your eyes moving slowly from one stone to the next, your breathing as even and gentle as the flame that continues to burn beside you. The selection is done, and all is calm. The 4 stones rest on the bench before you, each one sitting on its own small square of folded linen, and the lamplight continues its patient illumination of the workspace. The pause you have taken stretches into a comfortable stillness that asks nothing of you, and when you finally lean forward again, the movement comes from a place of natural readiness rather than decision. You reach for the shallow terracotta bowl that sits at the back of the bench, a wide, low-sided vessel with a slightly uneven rim that a potter shaped long ago with hands now forgotten. The clay is a warm reddish-brown unglazed on the outside and smooth from use, while the interior carries a darker patina from years of holding water and sediment. You place the bowl directly in front of you, centering it between the grinding slab and the row of stones. Its weight is light, and it makes a soft, hollow sound when it touches the wood, a gentle talk that fades quickly into the quiet air. The bowl is clean, but you tilt it toward the lamplight anyway, checking the interior for any dust or debris that might have settled there since the last time you used it. The surface is bare, slightly dusty at the very bottom, and you blow across it once with a gentle, steady breath that sends a few invisible particles scattering toward the shadows at the back of the bench. Now you reach for the clay water pitcher, a tall, slender vessel that stands on the floor at the end of the bench, its shape elegant in its simplicity. The pitcher is cool to the touch, the terracotta slightly damp from the evaporation of the water it holds, and you lift it with both hands, feeling the shift of liquid inside as you raise it to the level of the bench. The pitcher has a small pinched spout and a single loop handle that fits comfortably under your curled fingers, and you tilt it slowly, carefully, watching the first thin stream of water arc from the spout into the bowl. The water catches the lamplight as it falls, turning into a liquid ribbon of pale gold that coils into the bowl with a soft, continuous splashing sound. You pour with a steady, unhurried hand, filling the bowl to a depth of about 2 finger widths, enough to cover the stones without overflowing when they are added. The surface of the water quivers for a moment after you stop pouring, small concentric ripples traveling from the center to the clay walls and back again, gradually flattening into a perfect mirror-like stillness. You set the pitcher back on the floor, tilting it slightly so that the spout does not drip onto the stone flags, and you return your attention to the bowl. The water in the terracotta bowl looks different from the water in the cup. Here, contained in a wider, shallower vessel, it takes on a deeper color, reflecting the warm brown of the clay and the golden glow of the lamp together, so that it appears almost like weak tea or thin honey. You can see the faint shadow of the bowl's rim on the surface, and you can see, very faintly, the reflection of the lamp flame upside down, a tiny inverted teardrop of light that trembles only when you breathe too close to the water. Your first action is to take the red ochre stone from its place on the bench. You lift it with your right hand, feeling its familiar weight and the slight dustiness of its surface, and you hold it over the bowl for a moment, suspended just above the water. Your thumb and forefinger grip the stone lightly, and you lower it into the bowl with a slow, controlled motion that parts the water without splashing. The stone breaks the surface with a soft, liquid sound, and the water closes over it, enveloping the red ochre in a clear, trembling embrace. You watch the stone settle to the bottom of the bowl, where it rests against the clay with a faint, muted click. Under the water, the red ochre looks darker and richer, its color intensifying to a deep burgundy brown, and tiny bubbles cling to its surface for a few seconds before detaching and floating slowly upward to pop soundlessly at the surface. The water around the stone begins to cloud immediately, fine particles of loose dust lifting away in soft, swirling tendrils that spread through the bowl like smoke in still air. You dip the fingers of your left hand into the water, feeling its cool temperature against your skin, and you begin to rub the surface of the stone with slow, circular motions of your thumb. The touch is gentle but firm, working the embedded dust and grit free from the pores and crevices of the ochre. The water clouds further as you work, turning a translucent reddish-brown that obscures the stone from view, and you continue the rubbing motion without hurry, covering every face and edge of the stone by feel, rotating it under the water with your fingertips. The sensation of the wet stone under your fingers is pleasant and grounding. The ochre feels smoother when wet, less dusty, and it seems to release its grip on the impurities more readily under the water's gentle persuasion. You work your thumb into the small chip you noticed earlier, cleaning out any loose material that might be trapped there, and then you turn the stone over and repeat the process on its other side. Your movements are repetitive, almost hypnotic. The soft swishing of water and the faint scraping of skin on stone blending into a quiet, rhythmic soundscape. When you are satisfied that the stone is clean, you lift it out of the water with the same slow care you used to lower it in. The ochre drips a thin stream of cloudy water back into the bowl, the droplets making small circular ripples that spread and fade, and you hold the stone over the bowl for a moment to let the excess water drain away. The wet surface of the ochre is a different color entirely, a dark, almost purplish red that gleams softly in the lamplight, like the skin of a ripe plum. You place the washed stone on the coarse drying cloth you have laid out beside the bowl, a square of rough, unbleached linen that will absorb the moisture gradually. You turn back to the bowl, where the water has now settled into a uniform, cloudy suspension of fine red particles. The sediment that has already begun to fall to the bottom forms a thin, rusty layer on the clay, while the water above remains hazy and tinted. You do not pour this water out yet. It will serve for washing the other stones, as the small amount of red dust it contains will not harm the other pigments, and the act of washing itself will continue to draw impurities into the water. Now you pick up the yellow ochre, the soft, crumbly stone that sheds dust at the slightest touch. You handle it with particular gentleness, aware that its friable nature makes it prone to breaking apart if handled too roughly. The stone feels dry and chalky against your palm, and you lower it into the cloudy water with the same deliberate care, watching it slip beneath the surface and come to rest beside the faint red sediment at the bottom of the bowl. The yellow ochre behaves differently in water than the red did. It begins to soften at its edges almost immediately, releasing a pale, mustard-colored cloud that swirls up through the red-tinted water in slow, ghostly spirals. The two colors mingle for a brief moment, red and yellow swirling together like sunset clouds, before the yellow dominates and turns, the water a uniform warm amber tone. You rub the stone with your thumb, very gently, feeling its surface soften and yield slightly under the pressure, the outermost layer dissolving into a fine silty mud that washes away the loose impurities. You work quickly but without haste, knowing that the yellow ochre should not soak for too long, lest it begin to disintegrate. Your thumb moves in those same slow circles, covering the pitted, porous surface of the stone, feeling the tiny holes and irregularities under the pad of your skin. The water grows cloudier with each pass, and small fragments of the stone break away occasionally, tiny grains that you can feel rolling under your thumb before they dissolve into the general suspension. You lift the stone from the water sooner than you did the red ochre, judging that it has been cleaned enough, and you place it on the drying cloth beside its red companion. The wet yellow ochre is a revelation under the lamplight. Its color, which was a dusty, muted mustard when dry, has deepened into a rich golden amber that seems to hold light within its porous structure. Water droplets cling to its surface, magnifying the texture underneath, and the stone looks almost edible, like a lump of hardened honey or a piece of ancient crystallized resin. You look at it for a moment, appreciating the transformation, and then you turn your attention back to the bowl. The water is now a thick, opaque amber brown, too cloudy to see the bottom. You stir it slowly with one finger, watching the suspended particles swirl and dance, and you decide that it is time for fresh water before washing the remaining two stones. You lift the bowl with both hands, careful not to spill, and you carry it the few steps to the corner of the workshop where a small clay drain pot sits in the floor, a simple vessel filled with gravel and sand that filters the water slowly into the earth beneath. You pour the cloudy water into the drain pot, watching it disappear through the gravel with a soft, gurgling sound, leaving behind a thin film of ochre-colored silt on the surface of the stones. You make a mental note to clean the drain pot in the spring when the weather is warm and the days are long. You return to the bench, refill the bowl with fresh water from the pitcher, and set it back in its place. The clean water gleams under the lamplight, clear and inviting, and you turn your attention to the hematite. This stone is different from the ochres, harder and denser, with a metallic surface that does not absorb water or release dust in the same way. You pick it up, feeling its cool, heavy weight, and you lower it into the bowl, where it sinks quickly and strikes the bottom with a sharper click than the ochres produced. The hematite releases almost no visible dust into the water. A few tiny, glittering specks swirl away from its surface, fragments of mica or silica that were clinging to the fracture planes, but the water remains largely clear. You rub the stone with your thumb nonetheless, working over its smooth faces and its sharp edges, feeling the slick, almost glassy texture under the water. The hematite is easy to clean, its hard surface offering no hiding places for dirt, and you finish the washing quickly, lifting the stone from the bowl and placing it on the drying cloth with the others. The wet hematite gleams with a dark mirror-like luster, its surface reflecting the lamplight in a sharp silver point. Water droplets bead up on its smooth faces, reluctant to spread out, and they sit like tiny, perfect spheres of crystal, each one containing its own miniature reflection of the room. The stone looks colder and more intense when wet, its metallic nature fully revealed, and you can see, more clearly now, the faint shimmering grain that runs through it like the grain in a piece of forged iron. You pour fresh water into the bowl once more, the old water still clear, but carrying a faint metallic scent that you notice when you lean close. The drain pot accepts the water with the same soft gurgle, and you refill the bowl from the pitcher, which is now noticeably lighter than it was when you began. You make a mental note to refill the pitcher from the cistern before you finish for the night, though that task is still many hours away. The final stone to wash is the green earth, the cool, soapy-feeling piece that came from a distant trader. You pick it up and hold it over the bowl, pausing for a moment to appreciate its weight and its strange, muted color, so different from the warm ochres and the cold hematite. You lower it into the water, and it sinks with a soft, slow motion, its surface releasing a faint, pale green cloud that diffuses through the water like a drop of mist. The cloud is subtle, barely visible, just the lightest tint of celadon that shifts the water's color toward a cool, pale tone. You rub the green earth with your thumb, and the sensation is notably different from the other stones. Its surface, already soapy to the touch when dry, becomes even smoother and more slippery underwater, as if it generates its own thin lubricant. Your thumb glides across it with almost no friction, and the stone seems to release very little material, just a fine, pale silt that settles quickly. The washing is pleasant, the smooth sliding of your skin over the stone's surface, creating a repetitive, calming motion that you continue for longer than necessary, simply because it feels soothing. When you finally lift the green earth from the water, you notice that its color has shifted in a way that surprises you. The dry sage green has become a deeper, more vivid olive green, a color that speaks of damp forest floors and shaded glens, and the lamplight seems to penetrate the surface slightly, giving the stone a translucent quality at its thinner edges. Water clings to it in a thin, even film, and as you watch, a droplet breaks free and falls back into the bowl with a soft, singular plink that echoes briefly in the quiet room. You place the green earth on the drying cloth beside the other 3 stones, and you sit back on your stool to survey the row of washed minerals. They look different now, these 4 pieces of earth and metal, their true colors revealed by the water, their surfaces gleaming softly in the lamplight. The red ochre is a deep, plum dark burgundy, the yellow ochre glows like warm amber, the hematite shines with a steely, mirror-like brilliance, and the green earth rests in its subtle olive tone, quiet and unassuming among its more vivid companions. The drying cloth beneath them has already begun to darken with absorbed moisture, the rough linen wicking the water away from the stones and spreading it outward in slow, irregular patterns that look like maps of unknown coastlines. You watch the water travel through the fibers, the dark patches widening incrementally, and you let your gaze move slowly from one stone to the next, checking each one for any remaining dirt or loose material that you might have missed. The red ochre is clean, its surface free of dust, but you notice again the small chip on its side, and now that it is wet, you can see that the interior of the chip is a brighter, more vivid red than the weathered exterior. You pick up the stone and turn it in the lamplight, examining the chip more closely, and you decide that this small imperfection does not detract from the stone's value. If anything, it reveals the quality of the material inside, promising a rich, vibrant pigment once the grinding is done. The yellow ochre has shed a few more small fragments during the washing, and you pick these up carefully from the drying cloth, pinching them between your thumb and forefinger. The fragments are soft and crumbly, and they reduce to a fine, buttery powder with the slightest pressure. You collect the powder on a scrap of clean linen and set it aside, thinking that even these small crumbs will be useful when the time comes to grind, that nothing in this workshop is wasted, that every grain of pigment is precious and will find its place in a saint's halo or the fold of a robe. The hematite requires almost no inspection. Its hard, dense surface sheds water in tiny beaded droplets, and you polish it briefly with a corner of the drying cloth, buffing it to a dark, quiet gleam. The stone is ready, perfectly clean, and you set it back down with a sense of satisfaction that is too mild to be called an emotion, more like a faint internal nod of acknowledgement. The green earth you examine last, turning it slowly in your fingers, feeling its cool, waxy surface, now clean and smooth and slightly damp. You notice a small vein of paler material running through one side, a thread of almost white mineral that cuts across the olive green like a streak of chalk. You spend some time considering this vein, wondering whether to include it in the grinding or to break it away, and in the end you decide to leave it. The vein is thin and will likely be invisible once the stone is ground to a fine powder, and even if it lightens the green slightly, the effect may be pleasing, a subtle variation that adds depth to the final color. You place the green earth back on the drying cloth and let your hands rest on the edge of the bench, your fingers curling loosely over the wood. The lamplight flickers once, a brief, almost imperceptible flutter, and then it steadies. The flame has burned down slightly, and you lean forward to adjust the wick with a bronze pick, nudging it forward just enough to restore the flame to its proper size. The light brightens a fraction, and you settle back on your stool, your shoulders relaxing against the cool plaster of the wall. The washed stones are ready now, clean and sorted, their colors revealed and their impurities washed away. They sit in a quiet row on the darkening cloth, 4 small promises of color that wait patiently for the grinding slab. The night outside the high window has deepened to a full, velvety black, and the stars that were faint pinpricks earlier are now bright and numerous, though you do not look at them directly. The city around you has fallen into its deepest sleep, and the only sounds are the steady hiss of the lamp, the faint drip of water settling in the drain pot, and your own slow, gentle breathing, which moves in and out with the rhythm of a tide that knows no hurry. The 4 washed stones rest on the darkening linen cloth, their surfaces still damp and gleaming softly under the steady lamplight, and you let them be, for now, knowing that the moisture needs time to evaporate fully before the grinding can begin. Your attention shifts instead to the center of the workbench, where the porphyry grinding slab sits waiting, a dark rectangle of stone that has been part of this workshop longer than anyone alive can remember. It is a heavy, substantial thing, about the length of your forearm and half as wide, with the surface worn to a glassy smoothness by countless hours of patient labor performed by hands now gone to dust. You reach out and place both palms flat on the slab, feeling the cool, dense stone beneath your skin. The porphyry is a deep purple gray, almost black in the shadows, with tiny flecks of lighter feldspar scattered through it like stars frozen in a midnight sky. These flecks catch the lamplight and glint faintly, a subtle sparkle that rewards close attention, and you spend a quiet moment tracing the pattern of the lighter inclusions with your eyes, following the random ancient scatter of crystals that were formed deep in the earth long before any city stood on this coast. The surface of the slab is not perfectly flat, though it appears so at first glance. Years of grinding have worn a shallow, almost imperceptible depression in the center, a gentle hollow that cradles the pigment paste during the grinding process and prevents it from spreading too quickly toward the edges. You run your fingertips over this hollow, feeling the subtle curve, the way the stone dips and then rises again near the corners. The texture is smooth, smoother than any wood or ceramic in the workshop, a polished slickness that comes only from the repeated friction of stone against stone over decades of use. Before any pigment can touch this surface, the slab must be cleaned and prepared, a ritual you perform with the same care each time, not out of any rigid habit, but because the work itself feels natural and right. A sequence of small, soothing actions that set the stage for everything that follows. You reach for a clean rag from the stack at the back of the bench, a square of soft, worn linen that has been washed many times and has faded to a gentle cream color. The rag is dry and slightly rough against your palm, and you fold it once into a neat pad that fits comfortably under your hand. You begin to wipe the surface of the slab with slow, circular motions, pressing down with a light, even pressure. The dry rag picks up a fine invisible dust that has settled on the stone since the last time you worked, and you move methodically from one end of the rectangle to the other, covering every inch with overlapping circles that leave no spot untouched. The motion is repetitive and calming, your hand traveling in a steady rhythm that requires no thought, and the only sound is the soft whispering drag of linen on polished stone, a sound like a gentle breeze moving through dry grass. When you have covered the entire surface once, you shake the rag out over the floor, releasing a faint puff of dust that scatters into the shadows beyond the lamplight, and then you fold it again and repeat the process. This second wiping is even slower, more deliberate, your circles smaller and more overlapped, as if you are polishing a precious mirror or burnishing a final coat of gesso. The slab begins to gleam under your ministrations, the dark stone taking on a subtle, reflective quality that bounces the lamplight back in a soft, diffuse glow. You set the rag aside and lean closer to inspect the surface. The lamplight slides across the porphyry in a smooth, unbroken sheet, revealing no scratches, no pits, no irregularities of any kind. The stone is ready, but you know from long experience that a purely mechanical cleaning is not enough, that the slab must also be dressed with a mild abrasive to ensure that no stray particles from previous pigments contaminate the colors you will grind tonight. This dressing process is itself a form of grinding, a miniature rehearsal for the main work, and you turn to the small clay pots on the shelf behind the bench to find the one marked with a scratched symbol that indicates ground pumice. The pot is small, no larger than a walnut, and its lid fits snugly, sealed with a thin smear of beeswax around the rim to keep the contents dry. You work the lid free with a gentle twisting motion, the wax releasing with a faint, tacky sound, and you peer inside. The pumice powder is a soft, pale grey, as fine as milled flour, and it shifts slightly in the pot as you tilt it toward the light. You take a tiny pinch between your thumb and forefinger, the powder feeling silky and insubstantial, and you sprinkle it across the center of the slab in a thin, even dusting that covers an area about the size of your palm. From the cup of water beside the lamp, you dip your fingers and let a few drops fall onto the pumice powder. The water beads up at first, reluctant to mix with the fine, airy dust, but then it soaks in, darkening the grey powder to a charcoal paste. You add a few more drops, watching the pumice absorb the water and transform into a thin, gritty slurry that spreads slightly under its own moisture. The paste is the consistency of thin mud, and it glistens faintly under the lamplight, a small dark puddle on the dark stone. Now you reach for the grinding muller, the hand-sized stone that is the companion to the slab. The muller is made of the same porphyry, a solid palm-filling piece with a flat bottom that has been worn perfectly level, and its sides are slightly tapered so that it fits comfortably in your grip. The top of the muller is rounded and smooth, polished by the constant pressure of palms over the years, and it feels cool and heavy when you lift it from its resting place beside the slab. You turn it over in your hand, examining the flat grinding surface, which gleams with the same dark flecked polish as the slab itself. You position the muller over the pumice paste, centering it carefully, and then you lower it onto the slab with a gentle, deliberate pressure. The paste squishes softly under the stone, spreading outward in a thin grey layer, and you begin to move the muller in a wide, steady figure-8 pattern that covers the entire surface of the slab. The motion is smooth and rhythmic, your shoulder and elbow working together in a fluid circular movement that feels as natural as breathing, and the muller glides over the stone with a soft, gritty sound that fills the quiet workshop. This sound, the gentle grinding of pumice against porphyry, is a whisper with a slight edge to it, a shh sound punctuated by a finer, higher hiss as the abrasive particles do their work. It is not an unpleasant sound, not harsh or jarring, but rather a kind of white noise that settles into the background of your awareness and becomes part of the general calm. You continue the figure-8 motion without pause, your hand tracing the same path over and over, the muller rotating slightly in your grip with each circuit so that the wear on its surface remains even. As you work, the pumice paste spreads thinner and thinner, covering more of the slab with each pass. The grey slurry forms delicate, feathery patterns at the edges, where the muller lifts slightly, tiny ridges and valleys that catch the lamplight and look like the surface of a distant, frozen sea. You pause once to scrape the paste back toward the center with a thin bone spatula, a tool that is yellowed with age and worn at the tip, and then you resume the grinding, your hand finding the rhythm again without any conscious effort. The purpose of this pumice dressing is twofold. It cleans the surface of the slab at a microscopic level, removing any traces of old pigment that might be embedded in the pores of the stone, and it also lightly roughens the polished surface, creating a subtle tooth that will help grip the pigment particles during the actual grinding. You do not think about these technical details as you work. You simply move the muller in its endless lazy loops, feeling the slight resistance of the stone against stone, listening to the soft, repetitive sound, and letting time flow past you like a slow, untroubled river. After a long while, when the pumice paste has been worked into a thin, nearly dry film that coats the slab in a uniform grey haze, you lift the muller and set it aside. The slab now looks quite different from its initial gleaming state. It is matte and pale, like a stone that has been dusted with ash, and the lamplight falls on it with a softer, more diffused quality. You take the bone spatula and scrape the spent pumice into a small pile at the center of the slab, gathering it carefully from all directions with short, precise strokes that make a faint, dry scraping sound against the porphyry. You collect the used pumice on a scrap of linen and set it aside, not to be reused, but to be discarded later in the drain pot, where it will filter down through the gravel and return to the earth from which it came. The slab now needs to be rinsed, and you reach for the water cup, tilting it over the stone and letting a thin stream of water flow across the surface. The water pools in the shallow central depression, and you use a clean corner of the rag to wipe the slab in slow sweeping arcs, washing away the last traces of the pumice and revealing the clean, dark stone beneath. The rinsed slab gleams once more, but with a subtle difference. The surface now has a slight, almost imperceptible texture that you can feel when you run a fingertip across it, a very fine tooth that is just barely there, like the skin of a ripe pear. This is the perfect surface for grinding pigment, and you dry it carefully with a fresh cloth, buffing the stone in slow circles until it is completely free of moisture. The lamplight reflects off the dark surface in a single, soft glow, and you can see your own faint reflection in the stone, a shadowy face looking back at you from the depths of the porphyry. You take a moment to rinse the muller as well, dipping it in the bowl of water that still sits on the bench, and rubbing it clean with your fingers. The pumice residue slides off easily, and you dry the muller with the same care you used on the slab, buffing its flat bottom until it gleams. The two stones, slab and muller, now rest side by side on the bench, clean and prepared, their surfaces ready to receive the first piece of ochre whenever you decide the moment is right. Before moving on to the grinding itself, you perform one final check of the slab. You lean close, bringing your face near the surface of the stone so that your breath fogs a small patch, and you watch the fog fade quickly, revealing the clean, even texture beneath. You turn the slab slightly, angling it toward the lamp so that the light rakes across the surface at a low angle, and you look for any irregularities, any scratches or pits that might mar the smoothness. The stone is perfect, as near to flawless as any worked object can be, and you nod once, a tiny, private gesture of satisfaction that no one sees. The lamplight continues its steady glow, the flame a small, unwavering presence at the edge of your vision, and the workshop holds its quiet like a held breath. You can hear, very faintly, the distant sound of waves against the sea walls, a low, rhythmic pulse that has been there all along but that you only now notice, a sound so constant and deep that it feels like the heartbeat of the city itself. The air is cool but not cold, and the smell of the room has shifted slightly with a rinsing of the slab, a fresh, clean, mineral scent that mingles with the older notes of oil and wood. You place the rinsed and dried muller to the right of the slab, positioning it so that the handle-like taper faces toward your hand, ready to be picked up without fumbling. The bone spatula goes to the left, the water cup just behind it, and the scrap of linen for wiping your fingers rests at the top edge of the bench. Everything is in its place, arranged in a small, functional order that pleases some deep, quiet part of your mind, and you sit back on the stool to survey the prepared workspace. The washed stones on their drying cloth have lost most of their surface moisture by now, the linen darkened in 4 distinct patches that correspond to the shapes of the minerals. The red ochre has dried to a deep, matte brick red, the yellow ochre to a dusty, warm gold, the hematite to a dark, steely grey, and the green earth to a pale, muted sage. They are ready, and the slab is ready, and the night stretches ahead in a long, uninterrupted span of quiet hours. You reach out and touch the slab once more, resting your palm flat on its cool, textured surface, feeling the slight tooth against your skin, and you let your hand rest there for a moment, a silent acknowledgement of the work that is about to begin. The grinding will be slow and repetitive, an hour or more of steady circular motion that will reduce the raw stones to fine silky powders, but you are in no hurry. The night is long, the lamp is full of oil, and the world outside the workshop has faded into a silence so complete that it feels like a kind of peace. The red ochre stone, now dry and warm from its washing, rests on the folded linen cloth where you left it. You pick it up with your right hand, feeling its familiar weight and the slightly gritty texture of its surface, and you hold it over the center of the prepared porphyry slab. The lamplight catches the stone's deep brick red color and casts a small soft shadow onto the dark stone below, a shadow that shifts slightly as your hand makes tiny, unconscious adjustments to its position. You lower the ochre until it touches the slab with a faint, dry click, and then you release it, letting the stone sit alone in the middle of the smooth, dressed surface. You take up the grinding muller in your right hand, your fingers curling around its cool, tapered sides, and you position the flat bottom directly above the red ochre chunk. The muller feels heavy and solid, its weight a comforting presence in your palm, and you lift it only a short distance before bringing it down in a single controlled tap that strikes the top of the ochre stone. The sound is a sharp, crisp crack, like a small pebble splitting underfoot, and the ochre fractures into several smaller pieces that scatter slightly across the slab. You tap once more gently this time, and the fragments break further, reducing to a collection of irregular shards and coarse grains that range in size from a lentil to a grain of rice. You set the muller aside for a moment and use your fingers to gather the broken pieces into a small pile at the center of the slab, sweeping the stray fragments inward with a light, careful touch. The raw ochre pieces are angular and rough. Their freshly broken surfaces are brighter, more vivid red than the weathered exterior, and they sparkle faintly under the lamplight where tiny silica inclusions catch the glow. You pick up one of the larger fragments and examine it briefly, turning it between your thumb and forefinger, noting the fine, even grain of the stone and the way it leaves a faint red smudge on your skin before adding it back to the pile. Now you reach for the water cup, the plain terracotta vessel with the small chip at its rim, and you dip your fingers into the cool liquid. You hold your wet fingers over the pile of ochre fragments and let a few drops fall, watching the water darken the stone instantly, turning the bright red to a deep, wine-dark burgundy. You add water sparingly, a drop at a time, until the pile is dampened but not soaped, the fragments glistening with a thin film of moisture that will help the grinding begin smoothly without sending dust into the air. You pick up the muller again and position it over the dampened ochre, centering its flat bottom on the pile. You press down with a gentle, even pressure, not grinding yet, just holding the stone against the fragments, feeling the slight crunch and give as the pieces settle under the weight. Then you begin to move the muller in a slow, wide circle, keeping it flat against the slab, your wrist and forearm working together in a fluid motion that travels clockwise around the pile. The initial sound is a grinding, crunching noise, like boots on loose gravel, as the muller crushes the larger fragments into smaller and smaller pieces. You continue the circular motion without pause, your hand describing a steady, deliberate path that widens gradually as the ochre fragments spread out beneath the stone. The crunching sound begins to soften after a dozen circuits, the larger pieces breaking down into a coarse, gritty paste that slides more easily under the muller. You can feel the texture changing through the stone in your hand, the initial sharp, angular resistance giving way to a smoother, more uniform grittiness that rolls under the muller like fine sand under a wave. The lamplight flickers once, a tiny flutter that you register without looking, and then it steadies, and you keep grinding. The motion of your arm settles into a natural, unhurried rhythm, a steady circling that requires no conscious direction. Your shoulder rocks gently in its socket. Your elbow opens and closes by small degrees, and your wrist remains firm, holding the muller level, pressing down with an even weight that you have learned over years of practice. The grinding sound fills the quiet workshop, a soft, continuous shushing that is punctuated by occasional, fainter crunches as a particularly resistant fragment finally gives way. The sound is monotonous and soothing, a kind of sonic blanket that wraps around you and isolates you from the distant, barely audible murmur of the sleeping city. After a time, you lift the muller and look at the paste that is forming on the slab. The ochre has been reduced to a thick, gritty mud that spreads in a rough circle around the grinding area, its color a deep, muddy red-brown that looks almost black in the shadows and brightens to a rich crimson where the lamplight strikes it directly. The paste is still coarse. You can see that at a glance, with tiny visible grains that catch the light and sparkle like minute gemstones. It needs much more grinding before it will be smooth enough for painting, and you are in no hurry to reach that point. You take the bone spatula from its place at the left of the slab and use the thin, flat edge to scrape the paste back toward the center, gathering it from all sides with short, careful strokes. The spatula makes a soft, scraping sound against the porphyry, a sound that is different from the grinding, higher and drier, and the paste collects into a dense, glossy mound in the middle of the slab. You clean the spatula against the edge of the water cup and set it aside. Then you add 2 more drops of water to the ochre pile, watching the moisture soak in and darken the paste further. You resume grinding, the muller finding its familiar path, and now the sensation under your hand is different. The paste has become slightly thinner and smoother with the added water, and the muller glides over it with less resistance, the gritty sound replaced by a finer, silkier whisper. You work the muller in the same steady, circular pattern, but now you add a slight variation, a figure-8 loop that covers more of the slab's surface and ensures that every particle of ochre passes under the stone many times. The figure-8 is a natural shape for the human arm to make, and your muscles fall into it easily, your hand tracing the same path over and over until the motion becomes as automatic as breathing. Time passes without your marking it. The lamplight continues its steady glow, the flame a small unwavering teardrop of gold, and the shadows in the corners of the workshop remain deep and still. You grind the ochre for a long, unmeasured stretch, pausing occasionally to scrape the paste back to the center, and add a drop of water when it becomes too dry and stiff. Each time you scrape, you notice the texture of the paste changing, growing finer and more uniform, the visible grains becoming fewer and smaller until they are barely distinguishable to the naked eye. At one point, you stop grinding and take a small sample of the paste on the tip of your finger, rubbing it between your thumb and forefinger. The sensation is velvety and cool, with a slight pleasant grittiness that you can feel but not see, like the texture of fine river silt. You hold your finger close to the lamplight and examine the thin film of ochre that coats your skin, a smooth, even layer of deep red-brown that is the color of dried roses or old brick. The paste is almost ready, but not quite. There is still a faint, barely perceptible graininess that tells you more grinding is needed. You wipe your finger on a scrap of linen and return the muller to the slab, resuming the slow, hypnotic circling. Your mind drifts gently as you work, not forming specific thoughts, but rather floating in a kind of quiet, attentive reverie. You notice the way the lamplight plays across the surface of the paste, creating tiny highlights that shift and shimmer as the muller passes over them. You notice the sound of your own breathing, slow and even, in time with the circling of your hand. You notice the cool air on the back of your neck and the solid, grounding weight of the sheepskin beneath you on the stool. The grinding continues, and the paste continues to refine. With each circuit of the muller, the ochre particles are broken down further, their sharp edges worn smooth by the relentless friction of stone against stone. The color of the paste deepens as the particles become finer, shifting from a muddy brown red to a clearer, more vibrant crimson that seems to glow with its own inner light. This is the true color of the ochre, the color that will one day become the red of a saint's robe or the warm undertone of a face, and you observe it with a quiet, detached appreciation. After another long interval, you stop again and test the paste once more. This time, when you rub it between your fingers, you can detect no grittiness at all, only a smooth, silky cream that spreads evenly and leaves a uniform stain on your skin. The paste is ready. You have ground the red ochre to the perfect consistency, a fine velvety pigment paste that is now ready for the next stage of the process, the levigation and washing that will separate out any remaining coarse particles and yield the purest, most refined pigment. You set the muller aside and take a long, slow breath, rolling your shoulders to release the slight stiffness that has accumulated from the repetitive motion. The grinding has taken perhaps an hour, perhaps longer. You do not know and do not care. The night is still deep, the lamp still has plenty of oil, and the workshop remains wrapped in its cocoon of quiet. You look at the mound of deep red paste on the slab, a small glossy hill of color that represents the transformation of a rough, dusty stone into a material of great value and beauty. Using the bone spatula, you scrape the paste carefully into a small, clean clay pot, working slowly to ensure that no pigment is left behind on the slab. The paste slides off the spatula in a smooth, heavy dollop, and you clean the tool against the rim of the pot before setting it aside. You then wipe the slab with a damp cloth, removing the last traces of ochre, and you dry it thoroughly, preparing it for the next pigment you may choose to grind, perhaps the yellow ochre or the hematite when the time comes. You place a lid on the pot of red ochre paste and press it down firmly, sealing the contents against dust and drying. The pot joins the other containers at the back of the bench, and you make a small scratch mark on the lid with your thumbnail, a simple line that will remind you later of the contents. The red ochre is done, its grinding complete, and the workshop feels subtly different now, as if the presence of the finished pigment has added a new note to the quiet atmosphere. You sit back on your stool and rest your hands in your lap, palms up, the fingers slightly curled from the work, but not tired. The lamplight flickers again, a tiny, gentle flutter, and you reach over to adjust the wick with the bronze pick, pushing it forward a hair's breadth so that the flame brightens slightly. Outside the high window, the sky is still dark, the stars still bright and numerous, and the distant sound of the sea continues its slow, eternal rhythm against the walls of the city. You are content, deeply and simply content, and you allow yourself to sit for a while longer in the quiet, savoring the stillness before the next task begins. The small clay pot of red ochre paste sits sealed on the bench beside you, its lid pressed down firmly, and the faint scratch mark you made on the terracotta catches the lamplight as a thin, pale line. The workshop around you is settled into a deep, comfortable silence, the kind of quiet that feels layered and old, built up over hours of stillness. You reach for the pot and lift it in both hands, feeling the slight coolness of the clay and the dense weight of the pigment paste inside, and you hold it for a moment without moving, simply acknowledging the work that has already gone into this small container of color. The next stage of the process is levigation, a word that means the washing and separating of the fine pigment particles from any remaining coarse grit. It is a slow, patient procedure that requires water, time, and a steady hand. And you have done it so many times that your body knows the steps without your mind needing to direct them. You set the pot down again gently and turn your attention to the shelf behind the bench where a tall glass jar stands among the other vessels. You reach for it with care, your fingers closing around its smooth, cool surface, and you bring it forward into the circle of lamplight. The jar is a simple, elegant shape, a cylinder of pale greenish glass that was blown by a craftsman long ago, its walls not perfectly straight, but slightly tapered toward the base, with tiny air bubbles trapped in the glass like frozen breath. It is about the height of your forearm and wide enough at the mouth to admit your hand, and its rim has been ground smooth, so that it does not catch on cloth or skin. You turn it slowly in the lamplight, checking for any cracks or dust, and the glass glows with a soft, sea-green translucence that casts a faint-colored shadow on the wooden bench. You set the jar on the bench in front of you, centering it carefully so that it will not be knocked over during the work, and you take a moment to wipe its interior with a clean, dry cloth wrapped around the end of a thin reed. The cloth comes away clean, and you set it aside. The jar is ready, and now you need water, a good amount of it, enough to fill the jar halfway. You reach for the pitcher on the floor, noting that it is lighter than before and will need refilling soon, and you pour a slow, steady stream into the jar, watching the water rise up the greenish glass in a smooth, silent column. The lamplight refracts through the glass and the water together, creating shifting patterns of pale green and gold that shimmer on the bench beside the jar, and you fill it to just above the midpoint before setting the pitcher back down. Now you turn back to the pot of red ochre paste. You work the lid free with a gentle twisting motion, the clay releasing with a soft, dry scrape, and you look inside at the smooth, glossy mound of deep crimson paste. The surface of the paste has developed a slightly darker skin where it was exposed to the air, and you stir it once with the tip of the bone spatula, breaking the skin and revealing the brighter, wetter pigment beneath. The smell that rises from the pot is clean and earthy, like wet stone after a summer rain, with no hint of rot or decay, because ochre is a mineral, stable and unchanging. You pick up the pot and hold it over the mouth of the glass jar, tilting it slowly, carefully, until the paste begins to slide toward the rim. The ochre moves as a single heavy mass, reluctant to separate, and you use the bone spatula to guide it, scraping the last of the pigment from the sides of the pot and letting it drop into the water below. The paste enters the water with a soft, deep plop, and it sinks immediately, a dark red cloud that spirals downward through the clear liquid like a column of smoke. The water around the paste blushes instantly, a translucent crimson that spreads outward in slow, feathery tendrils, and you watch the ochre settle toward the bottom of the jar in a dense, undulating layer. You set the empty pot aside and take up a slender reed that you keep for stirring, a dried stalk about the length of your forearm, its surface smooth and pale gold. You insert the reed into the jar and begin to stir the water and paste together, moving the reed in a slow, gentle spiral that starts at the center and gradually widens. The pigment swirls up from the bottom in thick, ropey clouds that coil and twist through the water, and the entire jar becomes a moving painting of deep reds, pale pinks, and translucent ambers, all shifting and flowing in the lamplight. You stir with a patient, unhurried motion, your wrist turning easily, the reed making no sound against the glass, and you continue until the paste has been fully dispersed, the water now a uniform, opaque crimson that you cannot see through. You withdraw the reed and set it aside, and then you sit back on your stool to wait. This is the heart of levigation, The waiting, the letting of gravity do its slow work. The heavier pigment particles, the ones that are fine and pure and ready for use, will sink through the water at a steady, predictable rate, settling to the bottom of the jar in a dense, even layer. The lighter impurities, the tiny bits of silica and the occasional fragment of organic matter, will remain suspended in the water longer, drifting slowly downward, but not yet reaching the bottom. By timing the settling correctly and pouring off the water at the right moment, you can separate the pure pigment from the waste. You watch the jar with a calm, patient attention, your hands resting loosely in your lap. The water is too opaque to see the settling process directly, but you know from experience how it unfolds, the heaviest particles dropping first, a soft, silent rain of crimson grains falling through the liquid, while the lighter impurities drift in a slow, suspended dance. The surface of the water remains still, a flat, dark red disk that reflects the lamplight in a single, steady gleam, and you fix your eyes on this surface without staring, simply letting it fill your awareness. Time passes in its quiet, unmeasured way. The lamplight continues its steady glow, the flame a small golden teardrop that has burned without flickering for a long while now. The distant sound of the sea is still there, a low, constant murmur that you feel more than hear, a vibration in the stone walls that is as much a part of the workshop as the bench or the slab. You breathe slowly, your chest rising and falling in a rhythm that matches the gentle pulse of the night, and you wait. After a span of time that feels neither long nor short, you notice a change in the jar. The water near the surface has begun to clear, just slightly, a subtle lightening of the deep crimson that suggests the heaviest particles have already settled. You lean forward and observe the jar more closely, tilting your head to catch the light at a different angle. A thin band of clearer pinkish liquid is forming at the top of the water column, while the deeper parts remain dark and opaque. This is the signal you have been waiting for, and you reach for a clean, empty clay pot that you have set aside for this purpose. The next step requires a steady hand and a slow, deliberate motion. You lift the glass jar carefully, gripping it with both hands, and you tilt it very slightly toward the waiting clay pot. The water inside shifts, the surface angling toward the rim, and you begin to pour off the top layer of liquid, the part that contains the suspended impurities. The pouring is done with an almost painful slowness, a thin, continuous trickle of pinkish water that runs over the glass rim and down into the clay pot below. You watch the stream carefully, your eyes fixed on the point where the water leaves the glass, and you adjust the tilt of the jar by tiny, incremental degrees to keep the flow steady and thin. The sound of the pouring is a soft, liquid trickle, a gentle splashing that is barely louder than the lamp's hiss. The water in the jar grows darker as the level drops, the clearer top layer giving way to the denser, more pigmented liquid below, and you watch for the moment when the poured water begins to carry visible pigment with it. This is the critical point. You want to pour off as much of the impurity-laden water as possible without losing any of the fine pigment that has already settled. When you see the first faint streak of red appear in the trickle, you stop pouring immediately, righting the jar with a smooth, careful motion and setting it back on the bench. The clay pot now contains a quantity of pinkish, slightly cloudy water, and you set it aside to be discarded later in the drain pot. The glass jar contains the remaining water, still quite dark and dense with pigment, and a thick layer of fine red ochre that has settled to the bottom. You peer down through the water, and although the liquid is too opaque to see the bottom clearly, you can make out the dark, solid mass of pigment resting against the glass, its surface slightly uneven, like the sea floor seen through deep water. The process now repeats. You add fresh water to the jar from the pitcher, filling it back to the halfway mark, and you stir the pigment up from the bottom with the reed, dispersing it through the clean water in swirling crimson clouds. The fresh water lightens the color slightly, shifting it from a deep burgundy to a brighter, clearer red, and you stir for a long, patient while, ensuring that every particle of pigment is suspended, that no clumps remain stuck to the bottom of the jar. Then you set the reed aside and wait again, watching the surface of the water as the settling begins anew. This second settling takes less time than the first because there are fewer impurities to separate. You wait with the same calm patience, your eyes on the jar, your breathing slow and even. The water clears more quickly this time, the top band of paler liquid appearing sooner and growing more distinct, and you pour it off with the same meticulous care, tilting the jar by fractions, the thin stream of wastewater running into the clay pot with a soft, continuous trickle. Again you stop at the first sign of pigment in the pour, righting the jar and setting it back on the bench. You repeat the washing a third time, adding fresh water, stirring, waiting, and pouring. By now, the water in the jar is a clear, bright red, no longer murky or opaque, and the pigment at the bottom is settling into a dense, even layer that looks smooth and velvety, like the finest silt. The water you pour off in this third washing is barely tinted, a pale, translucent rose that suggests most of the loose impurities have already been removed. You hold the clay pot of wastewater up to the lamplight and observe the faint, milky cloudiness that remains suspended in it, a sign of the fine silica and other light particles that you have successfully separated from the pigment. A fourth washing, and the water above the settled pigment runs almost perfectly clear. You pour it off with the same slow care, and then you lean close to the glass jar, looking down through the remaining water at the layer of red ochre on the bottom. The pigment is a deep, vivid crimson, darker than it was as a paste, its surface smooth and level, and it seems to glow slightly in the lamplight. A rich, warm color that holds the promise of all the paintings it will one day become. You decide that a fifth and final washing is in order, just to be certain, and you add a small amount of fresh water, stir gently, wait for the settling, and pour off the water one last time. This final pour is perfectly clear without a trace of cloudiness or color, and you nod once, a small private acknowledgement that the levigation is complete. The red ochre pigment at the bottom of the jar is now as pure as you can make it, a fine velvety powder that contains no grit, no impurities, nothing but the essence of the earth from which it came. You set the glass jar aside in a warm corner of the bench, where the gentle heat from the lamp will help the remaining moisture evaporate slowly over the coming hours. You do not cover the jar. The pigment needs to breathe as it dries, and you will check on it periodically throughout the night. In a day or two, when the powder is completely dry, you will scrape it out of the jar and store it in a lidded pot, ready to be mixed with binder when the time comes to paint. For now it rests, a layer of pure wet pigment gleaming darkly at the bottom of the greenish glass. You rinse your hands in the water cup and dry them on a scrap of linen. Then you sit back on your stool and survey the workshop. The red ochre has traveled a long journey tonight, from a rough dusty stone to a washed fragment, from a ground paste to a purified pigment settling quietly in its jar. The other stones, the yellow ochre, the hematite, and the green earth, still wait on their drying cloth, and you will attend to them in time. For now the night is still deep, the lamp still glows, and you allow yourself a long, quiet pause, your hands resting and your mind as still as the surface of water in a bowl. The glass jar of washed red ochre rests in its warm corner of the bench, the pigment settling into a dense, velvety layer under the slowly clearing water. And you turn your attention now to a different task, one that requires a different kind of care. The pigment alone, no matter how finely ground or perfectly washed, cannot become paint by itself. It needs a binder, a medium that will hold the tiny particles of color together and make them adhere to the gessoed panel. You have made this binder many times before, and you will make it many times again, and each time the process is the same slow, careful sequence of small actions that you are about to begin. You rise from the stool for the first time in a long while, your legs moving with a slight stiffness that eases as you stand. The sheepskin rustles softly as your weight leaves it, and you stretch your arms once, slowly, your shoulders rolling back and your spine lengthening against the cool air. You walk the few steps to the small wooden shelf that is fixed to the wall near the door, where a covered basket holds the eggs you collect each morning from the hens kept in the small courtyard behind the workshop. The basket is a simple thing of plaited straw, its lid fitted loosely to allow air to circulate, and you lift the lid now and peer inside. 3 eggs rest in the nest of straw. Their shells are pale, warm cream color, each one slightly different in shape and size. You select one that feels right in your palm, not too large and not too small, its shell smooth and clean, and you hold it up to the lamplight for a brief inspection. The shell is opaque, giving away no secrets, but it is fresh, laid within the last day or two, and that freshness matters, because the yolk must be strong and intact for the binder to form properly. You return the basket to its place and carry the egg back to the bench, cupping it gently in your palm. Beside the grinding slab, you have a small ceramic cup reserved specifically for the binder. A shallow bowl with a slightly flared rim that is glazed on the inside to a smooth, glassy finish. You set this cup in front of you and then reach for a clean, dry cloth, a square of fine linen that you spread flat on the bench beside the cup. The preparation of the egg requires a gentle touch and a steady hand, and you take a moment to center yourself, your breathing slow and even before you begin. You pick up the egg and tap it once, very lightly, against the rim of the ceramic cup. The shell cracks with a faint, sharp sound, a hairline fracture that runs across the curve of the egg, and you work the tips of your thumbs into this crack, applying a slow, steady pressure that widens the opening without shattering the shell. The egg divides cleanly into 2 halves in your hands, and you hold them over the cup, letting the thick, clear white begin to slide out. You tip the yolk carefully from one half shell to the other, catching the white as it separates and letting it fall into the cup below, a slow glistening stream that pools in the bottom of the ceramic vessel. The yolk remains in the shell, a perfect golden sphere held together by its thin, translucent membrane. You continue the gentle tipping motion, transferring the yolk back and forth between the 2 shell halves, each pass allowing a little more of the white to drip away into the cup. The yolk glows in the lamplight, a deep orange-gold color that comes from hens that scratch in the sun and eat green things, and its surface is glossy and smooth, like a tiny liquid sun. When almost all the white has been separated, you tip the yolk one final time and let it rest in a single half shell, a small trembling globe of concentrated color. Now you need to remove the last traces of white and the thin membrane that encases the yolk, because any white left behind will weaken the binder and cause it to dry too quickly and unevenly. You take up a second cloth, this one dry and soft, and you spread it flat on the palm of your left hand. Then, with a careful, deliberate motion, you tip the yolk out of the shell and onto the cloth, where it rolls gently like a bead of thick honey. The yolk does not break. It holds its shape, a resilient, elastic ball that quivers slightly as it settles onto the linen. You fold the edges of the cloth up around the yolk, creating a loose pouch, and you begin to roll the yolk gently from one hand to the other, letting the cloth absorb the thin film of white that still clings to the membrane. The motion is soft and rhythmic, a slow back-and-forth transfer that requires almost no pressure, just the gentle momentum of the yolk rolling against the fabric. The lamplight catches the movement, a repeated soothing pattern of shadow and light, and you continue this rolling for a short while, feeling the yolk grow slightly drier and less slippery as the last of the white is wicked away. When the yolk feels clean and almost dry to the touch through the cloth, you bring it back to the bench and carefully unfold the linen, revealing the yolk once more. It is still intact, still perfect, its surface now slightly matte where the cloth has dried the membrane. The yolk sac looks taut and firm, a little pouch of liquid gold, and you pick it up with your fingers, handling it with the lightest possible touch, and transfer it to the ceramic cup that now holds the separated white. You do not need the white for this binder, only the yolk, and so you'll discard the white later, or perhaps give it to a neighbor who uses it for other purposes. For now, you focus entirely on the yolk, which sits in the cup like a strange, soft jewel. You take a fine needle from a small leather case on the shelf, a slender steel pin set into a wooden handle, and you hold it poised over the yolk. With a single swift motion, you pierce the membrane at the top of the sac, and the yolk begins to flow out through the tiny hole. A thick, slow stream of deep orange gold that pools in the bottom of the cup. You hold the pierced sac over the cup and let the yolk drain completely, the membrane collapsing slowly as its contents empty. When the last drop has fallen, you discard the empty sac on a scrap of linen and turn your full attention to the liquid yolk in the cup. It gleams under the lamplight, a viscous, glossy fluid that is almost opaque in its density, and it smells faintly sweet and rich, a clean, organic scent that mixes pleasantly with the mineral smell of the workshop. From the shelf behind the bench, you retrieve the glass jar of clarified linseed oil, the same jar you noted earlier with the thick amber contents. You set it on the bench and loosen the lid, which comes away with a soft, tacky sound, and you take a slender glass rod from its resting place beside the jar. The rod is about the length of your hand, clear glass with a rounded tip, and you use it to stir the oil gently before you measure it out, watching the thick liquid swirl slowly in the jar. The oil is the product of many patient weeks of preparation. You pressed the linseeds yourself, or perhaps you bought the raw oil from a merchant near the Forum, and then you poured it into a wide, shallow pan and set it in the sun on the roof of the workshop for day after day, stirring it occasionally, letting the light bleach it from a deep amber to a paler, clearer gold. Some thickened and clarified, The oil now has a honey-like consistency and a clean, nutty scent, and it will mix with the egg yolk to form a durable, flexible binder that has been used by painters for centuries. You tip the jar very slightly and let a few drops of the oil fall into the cup with the egg yolk, counting them as they land. 1 drop, 2 drops, 3 drops, each one a tiny, glistening bead of amber that sits on the surface of the yolk for a moment before beginning to merge. You add a few more drops, judging the amount by eye and by experience, knowing that the ratio of yolk to oil must be balanced carefully. Too much oil, and the paint will dry slowly and remain sticky. Too little, and it will be brittle and prone to cracking. Next to the oil jar sits a small clay vial stocked with a cork, and this vial contains a mild vinegar made from wine that has soured gently over time. You pull the cork with a soft pop and pour a tiny splash of the vinegar into the cup. Just a few drops, barely enough to shift the color of the yolk slightly. The vinegar serves as a preservative, slowing the natural spoilage of the egg and giving the binder a longer working life, and it also helps the emulsion form more readily. The sharp, faintly fruity scent of the vinegar cuts through the richer smells of yolk and oil, adding a bright, clean note to the air. Now you take up the glass stirring rod and lower its rounded tip into the cup, and you begin to stir the mixture of yolk, oil, and vinegar together. You start with a slow, even circular motion, the rod traveling around the perimeter of the cup, and you watch the ingredients begin to combine. At first, the oil sits in separate droplets within the yolk, tiny amber beads that refuse to blend, but as you stir, the droplets break down and merge, and the mixture begins to smooth into a uniform, glossy emulsion. The stirring motion is repetitive and calming, your wrist turning in a steady, gentle rhythm, the glass rod making a soft, liquid whispering sound as it moves through the thickening binder. You stir in one direction for a while, watching the color change from a streaky orange amber to a smoother, more even tone, and then you reverse the direction and stir the other way, ensuring that every part of the mixture receives the same attention. The lamplight reflects off the surface of the emulsion in a single creamy gleam, and the binder gradually takes on the consistency of heavy cream, thick enough to coat the rod in a smooth, unbroken film. You lift the rod from the cup and hold it up to the light, turning it slowly. The binder clings to the glass in a thin, even layer, a translucent golden amber coating that does not run or drip, and when you touch it with a fingertip, it feels slightly tacky and smooth, with no graininess or separation. This is the sign of a good emulsion, a binder that has fully combined and will hold the pigment particles in perfect suspension, drying to a durable, luminous film. You return the rod to the cup and stir for a while longer, not because it is necessary, but because the motion is pleasant and soothing, and you want to be absolutely certain that the emulsion is stable. The scent that rises from the cup is complex and warm, the nutty oil blending with the sweet yolk and the faint sharp vinegar, a smell that you have come to associate with the quiet hours of night and the beginning of many paintings. When you are fully satisfied, you set the glass rod aside on a clean cloth and take up a small flat piece of slate that you keep for covering the cup. The slate is cool and dark, roughly square, its edge is worn smooth from handling, and it fits perfectly over the mouth of the cup, sealing the binder against dust and keeping it fresh for the hours ahead. You press it down gently and set the covered cup at the back of the bench, beside the jar of red ochre and the pots of other pigments, where it will wait until you are ready to mix the first colors. You rinse your fingers in the water cup and dry them on a scrap of linen, and then you sit for a moment in the quiet, letting the stillness of the workshop settle around you once more. The egg white in the cup will need to be dealt with, and you pour it carefully into a small clay pot that you will carry outside in the morning, perhaps to give to the neighbor who uses it for stiffening linen, or to feed to the hens themselves. You clean the cup with a little water and a cloth, wiping it dry and returning it to its place on the shelf. The binder is ready, a small cup of golden emulsion that holds within it the potential for every stroke of the brush, every highlight and shadow, every fold of a saint's robe or calm gaze of a holy face. It rests under its slate cover, patient and still, while the night continues its slow passage outside the workshop walls, and the lamplight burns on in its steady, unwavering glow. The binder, sealed under its small slate cover, rests at the back of the bench in quiet readiness, and the jar of washed red ochre continues its slow settling in the warm corner near the lamp. You turn your head to the left, where a stack of wooden panels leans against the plaster wall, each one a rectangle of cypress wood prepared long in advance for the work of painting. The panels have been waiting in this same spot for weeks. Their surfaces are uniform, creamy white in the dimness, and you let your gaze rest on them for a long, unhurried moment before you decide to choose one for the night's next step. You rise from the stool, your body moving with a slow, deliberate ease, and you cross the small distance to the stack in 3 quiet steps. The floor flags are cool under your bare feet, the stone worn smooth by countless passages, and you can feel the slight unevenness of their edges through the thin leather of your sandals. The stack consists of 5 panels, each separated from the next by a thin strip of scrap wood to allow air to circulate, and you kneel down beside them, your knee pressing into the soft sheepskin you have pulled from the stool to cushion the hard floor. The panels are all of a size, cut from cypress planks that were seasoned for 2 full years before being worked. The wood is pale and light, with a tight, straight grain that runs vertically through each board, and it carries a faint, resinous scent that rises when you lean close, a clean, dry fragrance reminiscent of cedar, but softer, more subdued. You run your hand over the exposed edge of the top panel, feeling the smooth, planed surface of the wood where it has not been covered by gesso, and you note the 2 small dowels that join the boards together, tiny pegs of oak driven through pre-drilled holes and trimmed flush with the surface. The joinery is tight and precise, the seam between the 2 boards barely visible, and you nod once, a small private acknowledgement of the carpenter's skill. You lift the first panel carefully, gripping it by its edges, and you raise it from the stack with the same slow care you would use to lift a sleeping child. The panel is about the length of your forearm in each direction, a square of cypress slightly wider than it is tall, and its weight is surprisingly light for its size. You carry it back to the bench, holding it flat like a tray, and you set it down gently on the cleared workspace, arranging it so that the gessoed surface faces up toward the lamplight. The gesso ground that covers the panel is a material you prepared yourself many weeks ago, a mixture of fine chalk and animal hide glue that you cooked slowly over a low fire, stirring until it reached the consistency of thick cream. You applied it to the raw wood in layer after thin layer, each coat brushed on with long, even strokes, and allowed to dry completely before the next was added, a process that took days of patient repetition. After the final layer had dried hard and white, you spent many hours burnishing it, rubbing the surface with a smooth agate stone and a tuft of soft linen. until it achieved a finish like polished ivory. All of that work is now a memory, a distant sequence of quiet mornings and afternoons, and the result sits before you now, glowing softly under the lamplight. You lean forward and examine the gessoed surface up close, bringing your face near enough that your breath creates a faint, fleeting fog on the white ground. The surface is smooth, remarkably smooth, with a soft velvety sheen that catches the light in a broad, diffuse glow. The color is a warm, creamy white, not stark or cold, because the hide glue imparts a slight amber undertone to the chalk, and this warmth will influence every layer of paint that goes on top of it, lending a subtle golden radiance to the finished icon. You tilt the panel slightly, angling it toward the lamp, and you watch the light slide across the surface like water over a flat stone, revealing no bumps, no pits, no irregularities of any kind. Despite its apparent perfection, you know from experience that even the best gessoed panel can collect tiny flaws over time. A speck of dust that settled while the last coat was drying, a stray bristle from the brush, a faint scratch from the corner of another panel in the stack. Your task now is to examine every inch of the surface with a slow, methodical attention, searching for any imperfection that might mar the painting to come. You begin at the upper left corner and let your eyes travel slowly across the panel, moving in a steady, horizontal path from left to right, then dropping down a finger's width and traveling back from right to left, the same way a scribe reads a page of text. Your gaze is unhurried and patient, and you cover the entire surface in this manner, noting the subtle, almost invisible variations in the gesso's texture. Here a slightly denser patch where the brush overlapped. There a faint, wispy line where a bubble in the glue burst and healed over. None of these are flaws that need correction. They are simply the natural character of the material, the fingerprints of the process. Your fingertips join your eyes in the inspection. You extend your right hand and touch the surface of the gesso with the pads of your first two fingers, pressing down with the lightest possible pressure. The sensation is cool and smooth, like touching a piece of fine marble that has been left in the shade, and you slide your fingers across the surface in a slow, continuous motion, feeling for any bumps or raised spots that your eyes might have missed. The gesso glides under your touch with a silky, slightly chalky feel, and as your fingers travel, you close your eyes for a moment, letting the tactile sensation become your whole world. There is a tiny grain of something near the lower right corner, a minuscule speck that you can feel more than see, and you open your eyes and locate it. A single dark particle no larger than a grain of fine sand that has become embedded in the surface. You pick it out carefully with the tip of your fingernail and brush it away onto the floor, and then you continue the inspection, your fingers moving in their slow, steady sweep across the white ground. When you are satisfied that the surface is free of defects, you reach for the horsehair brush that hangs from a small peg on the wall beside the bench. The brush is a simple tool, a bundle of long, pale horsehair bound to a wooden handle with a wrapping of waxed linen thread, and its bristles are soft and flexible, ideal for dusting delicate surfaces without scratching them. You take it down and run your palm over the bristles to loosen any dust that might be clinging there, feeling the fine silky strands slit through your fingers like water. The brush is clean, and you bring it to the panel. You begin to dust the gessoed surface with long, lazy strokes that start at the top of the panel and sweep downward in a smooth, continuous motion. The horsehair glides over the gesso with a faint whispering sound, like the rustle of dry grass in a light breeze, and each stroke carries away the almost invisible layer of dust that has settled on the surface since the panel was last handled. You work methodically, overlapping each stroke slightly with the one before it, and you watch the fine powder lift into the air in a pale, drifting cloud that catches the lamplight for a brief moment before vanishing into the shadows beyond the bench. The dusting is a quiet, rhythmic activity, and your arm moves in a steady automatic rhythm that requires no thought, only the gentle repetition of the brush traveling from top to bottom, its path as predictable as the tide. After you have covered the entire surface once, you pause and examine the panel again. The dusting has removed the loose particles, but you notice a faint, almost invisible film of fine chalk that the brush left behind, a residue so thin that it is only visible when the light strikes the surface at an oblique angle. This is normal, a natural result of the dusting process, and you'll remove it with the next step, a careful buffing that will bring the gesso to its final gleaming perfection. You set the horsehair brush aside and reach for a piece of soft linen cloth, a square of old, finely woven fabric that has been washed so many times it has become as soft as a moth's wing. You fold it once into a pad that fits comfortably under your palm, and you begin to buff the surface of the gesso in a slow circular motion, moving your hand in small overlapping circles that cover the entire panel. The pressure you apply is light and even, just enough to create a gentle friction that warms the gesso slightly and brings up a soft, luminous sheen. The motion is repetitive and deeply soothing, your hand traveling in those same small circles for minute after minute, and the sound of the linen against the gesso is a soft, continuous swish that is barely audible above the lamp's hiss. As you work, your mind drifts into a state of calm, focused emptiness. You are aware of the texture of the cloth under your palm, the smooth resistance of the gesso, the way the lamplight reflects off the polished surface in a broad, creamy glow. But you do not form any particular thoughts about these things. You simply exist in the moment, your hand moving in its endless, soothing circles, your breathing slow and even, your body a quiet weight on the stool. The buffing continues for a long, unmeasured interval, and by the time you finish, the gesso has taken on a deep, satiny luster that seems to glow from within, a surface so smooth and white and perfect that it looks almost edible, like the top of a panna cotta or the inner curve of an eggshell. You lift the linen cloth and examine the panel one final time, tilting it this way and that in the lamplight, searching for any remaining imperfections. The surface is flawless, a pure, unbroken field of creamy white that fills your vision with a quiet, restful emptiness. This panel is now ready to receive the first outlines of the icon, the faint charcoal marks that will guide the placement of the holy figure's face, hands, and robes. The thought of this next stage drifts through your mind without urgency, a distant, pleasant anticipation, and you set the panel down carefully on the bench, propping it slightly against a block of wood so that its surface remains protected and undisturbed. You take a moment now to stretch your fingers, which have become slightly stiff from the repetitive buffing motion, and you roll your wrists slowly, feeling the small joints pop and release. The night outside the high window is still deep and dark, the stars still bright against the blackness, and the distant murmur of the sea continues its eternal soothing rhythm. The lamp flame has burned down slightly, and you adjust the wick with the bronze pick, coaxing it back to its steady golden glow. Then you return your attention to the prepared panel, which rests before you like a blank page waiting for the first word, and you let yourself feel a quiet, simple satisfaction that is too mild to be called pride, more like a gentle, internal warmth that spreads through your chest and fades into the general calm of the night. The gessoed panel rests before you on the bench, propped at a slight angle against a small block of wood, its surface a perfect luminous white that seems to hold the lamplight within itself rather than merely reflect it. You have dusted it and buffed it and examined every inch of it, and it is ready now to receive the first traces of the sacred image it will one day carry. The next stage is the transfer of the drawing, a delicate process that bridges the gap between the preparatory work and the painting to come, and you turn your attention to the leather case that sits on the shelf behind the bench, a dark, oblong shape that has waited patiently through all the earlier hours of the night. You reach for the case with both hands, lifting it down from its resting place and carrying it to the bench. The leather is old and supple, a deep cordovan brown that has darkened over years of handling, and its surface is tooled with a simple border of interlocking circles that you can feel under your fingertips. The case is fastened with two small bone toggles that fit through loops of braided sinew, and you work these toggles free one at a time, the bone smooth and cool against your thumb. The leather flap opens with a soft, dry creak, and you fold it back carefully, exposing the contents within. Inside the case lies a collection of thin parchment sheets, each one a completed drawing for a different icon, rolled loosely and tied with a strand of undyed linen thread. You reach in and let your fingers drift among the rolls, peeling the crisp, slightly waxy texture of the parchment, the slight variations in thickness from one sheet to the next. Some of these drawings you made yourself, working out the composition with charcoal and correcting it until every line was right, while others were inherited from the painter who taught you, copies of copies that trace their lineage back through generations of icon painters to the earliest images. You do not need to unroll them to know which is which. The weight of the parchment, the tightness of the roll, the position in the case, all tell you what you need to know. You select a roll from the middle of the stack, one that feels familiar in your hand, and you draw it out into the lamplight. The linen thread is tied in a simple slit knot, and you loosen it with a gentle pull, the thread falling away to reveal the drawing. You unroll the parchment slowly, using both hands to keep it flat, and you spread it out on the bench beside the gessoed panel. The parchment is a pale, translucent cream color, made from the skin of a kid treated with lime and scraped to a fine, even thinness, and it crackles softly as it unrolls, a sound like the rustle of dry leaves. The drawing on the parchment is rendered in faint charcoal, a soft, powdery black that has been fixed with a light wash of diluted gum so that it will not smudge too easily. It shows the calm, oval face of a figure looking straight ahead, with large, serene eyes set evenly beneath a smooth brow, a narrow nose, and the small mouth, whose lips are closed in a quiet, neutral expression. The head is surrounded by a circular halo, a perfect ring drawn with the aid of a compass, and below the face, the folds of a robe fall in simple, graceful lines that descend to the lower edge of the composition. One hand is raised in a gesture of blessing, the fingers held close together, the thumb lightly touching the third finger, and the other hand rests against the figure's chest, holding a closed scroll. It is an image you have painted many times before, and yet each time it feels slightly new, as if the familiar lines hold some quiet variation that you have not yet fully appreciated. You spend a long moment studying the drawing under the lamplight, your eyes travelling slowly over the charcoal lines. You note the proportions of the face, the distance between the eyes, the curve of the brow, the way the lines of the robe flow downward in a smooth, cascading rhythm. The drawing is not merely a sketch, but a precise, measured design, and along all of its lines you can see the tiny pinpricks that have been made with a fine needle. These holes are so small that they're almost invisible unless you hold the parchment up to the light, and they follow every contour of the composition, a dotted map that will guide the transfer of the image onto the white gesso ground. You lift the parchment carefully, holding it by its edges so that your fingers do not smudge the charcoal, and you position it over the gessoed panel. The alignment must be exact, and you take your time with this step, lowering the parchment slowly, checking the margins on all four sides, adjusting its position by tiny increments until it sits perfectly centered on the panel. The lamplight shines through the thin parchment, making it glow faintly, and you can see the white of the gesso through the pinholes, a constellation of bright specks that trace the form of the figure. To keep the parchment from shifting during the transfer, you place 4 small smooth stones at its corners, each one a water-worn pebble from the shore below the sea walls, grey and oval and cool to the touch. The stones anchor the parchment firmly without damaging it, and you check the alignment one final time, peering closely at the edges to ensure that nothing has moved. The parchment lies flat and still, its faint charcoal lines hovering just above the gesso, and everything is ready for the next step. Now you need the pouncing bag, a small cloth pouch filled with finely ground charcoal dust that you keep in a lidded pot on the shelf. You reach for it, lifting the pot down and working the lid free, and you take out the pouch by its gathered neck. The pouch is made of a square of loosely woven linen, folded around the charcoal dust and tied with a length of twine, and it is about the size of a small apple, fitting neatly in your palm. The charcoal inside is a very fine powder, ground from a piece of grapevine charcoal that you prepared yourself by burning the twisted twigs in a closed clay pot until they were reduced to a soft black, airy dust. You give the pouch a gentle shake, and a faint, dark puff escapes through the weave, drifting into the lamplight like a tiny, silent cloud. You hold the pouncing bag over the parchment and begin to tap it lightly with the fingers of your other hand, a soft, rhythmic patting that sends small puffs of charcoal dust down onto the surface of the drawing. The dust is so fine that it passes easily through the loose weave of the linen, falling in a thin, even shower onto the parchment, and you move the bag slowly across the entire surface, covering every area where the pricked lines run. The tapping motion is gentle and repetitive, a soft, muted drumming that makes almost no sound, just a faint, whispery pat that is barely louder than your own breathing. You work methodically from the top of the composition to the bottom, passing over the halo, the face, the raised hand, the folds of the robe, and the scroll, ensuring that every pinhole receives its share of the charcoal dust. As you work, the lamplight catches the descending particles, and for a brief, beautiful moment, the air between your hand and the parchment is filled with a shimmering dark glitter, a cascade of tiny black specks that dance and swirl before settling. The charcoal dust has a faint, dry smell, like old ashes and burnt wood, but it is not unpleasant, and it mixes with the other scents of the workshop to create a complex, layered aroma that you have come to think of as the smell of beginning. When you've covered the entire drawing with the charcoal dust, you set the pouncing bag aside and take a moment to observe the parchment. It is now lightly coated with a fine dark powder that clings to its surface, and beneath it, invisible to your eyes but already taking form, the charcoal is passing through the pinholes and settling onto the white gesso in a precise dotted replica of the composition. You let the parchment rest for a short while, giving the dust time to work its way through every hole, and you use this pause to clean your fingers on a damp cloth, wiping away the faint black residue that has accumulated on your skin. The moment has come to lift the parchment and reveal the transferred drawing. You remove the 4 smooth stones from the corners and set them aside, and then you take hold of the parchment by its upper edge, gripping it between your thumbs and forefingers with a light, steady pressure. You lift it slowly, carefully, peeling it away from the gesso in a smooth, continuous motion that does not jerk or drag. The parchment releases with a faint, soft rustle, and you hold it up and away, setting it aside on the bench with the charcoal side facing up so that it can be cleaned and reused another time. Now you turn your full attention to the gessoed panel, and what you see there brings a quiet, deep stillness to your heart. The transferred drawing lies on the white ground in a perfect, delicate ghost of the composition, a dotted outline made entirely of tiny charcoal specks that follow the contours of the face, the halo, the robe, and the hands with an exact, faithful precision. The dots are small and even, a soft, powdery black against the creamy white of the gesso, and they form a complete, readable image that seems to hover on the surface like a reflection on still water. The face gazes out at you with calm, patient eyes. The blessing hand is raised in a gesture of quiet authority, and the folds of the robe cascade downward in a smooth, flowing rhythm that guides the eye through the entire composition. You lean close to the panel and study the dotted lines with a careful, unhurried attention, your eyes moving slowly over every part of the drawing. The transfer has been successful. The lines are clear and unbroken, with no gaps or smudges, and the charcoal dust has settled evenly into the surface of the gesso. In a few places, the dots are fainter than they should be, particularly along the lower edge of the robe and the tip of the blessing hand, where the parchment may not have made perfect contact. This is a common occurrence, and it does not trouble you. You will reinforce these faint lines with a fine brush and a thin ink made from lampblack and water, a task that belongs to another quiet hour, perhaps later tonight or perhaps tomorrow, when the daylight returns and you can see the panel under a different quality of light. You reach for a small soft brush made from the tail fur of a squirrel, its bristles fine and flexible, and you use it to gently sweep away any loose charcoal dust that may have fallen outside the dotted lines. The brush moves in light, feathery strokes, disturbing nothing, and the stray particles lift away and drift into the shadows. The drawing is now clean and distinct, and you sit back on the stool to look at it from a slight distance, taking in the composition as a whole. The icon is beginning its slow journey into being. The gessoed panel is no longer a blank white field, but a space that contains a sacred image in waiting, a promise of color and form that will emerge over the coming days and weeks as you apply layer after thin layer of paint. The face will be built up from a dark olive underlayer to warm, luminous flesh tones. The halo will gleam with burnished gold, and the robe will take on a deep, rich crimson made from the very ochre you ground earlier tonight. All of this lies ahead, a long, patient road that you'll travel one brushstroke at a time, and you feel no urgency, no impatience, only a quiet, steady readiness to continue when the moment is right. You pick up the parchment drawing and gently shake the remaining charcoal dust back into the pouncing bag, tapping the edges of the parchment to release any particles that cling to its surface. Then you roll it carefully and tie it with a linen thread, returning it to the leather case where it will wait among the other drawings until it is needed again. The case closes with a soft, snug sound, and you set it back on the shelf, pushing it into its accustomed place against the plaster wall. The transferred drawing glows softly under the lamplight. Its dotted lines are delicate dark lacework on the white ground, and you let your gaze rest on it for a long, peaceful moment. The face looks back at you with its serene, timeless expression, and you feel a quiet connection to all the painters who have transferred this same image before you. In workshops across the city and across the centuries, each one bending over a gessoed panel in the lamplight, each one watching the dotted lines appear like a gentle revelation. The night is deep and still, the lamp burns on in its steady glow, and you are content to sit in the quiet, the panel before you and the hours ahead full of calm, patient possibility. The transferred drawing lies on the white gesso ground, its dotted charcoal lines a delicate, dark map of the image to come, and you let your gaze rest on it for a time that feels both brief and endless. The face looks out at you with its calm, patient eyes. The raised hand holds its blessing gesture still and quiet, and the folds of the robe descend in their gentle, flowing rhythm. The drawing is complete, but it is only a beginning, a faint ghost of the icon that will emerge over many slow hours of painting. Now the time has come to lay down the first transparent layer of color, the soft, pale wash that will establish the shadows and begin to give the image its depth. You turn away from the panel and reach for the small clay pot that holds the green earth pigment you ground and washed many nights before. The pot sits among the other containers at the back of the bench, its lid sealed with a thin smear of beeswax, and you pick it up and cradle it in your palm. The clay is cool against your skin, and you work the lid free with a gentle twisting motion, the wax releasing with a faint, tacky sound. Inside, the green earth powder rests in a fine, dry mound, its color a muted grayish sage that seems to absorb the lamplight rather than reflect it. You tilt the pot slightly, and the powder shifts with a soft, silky rustle, releasing a faint, dry scent that reminds you of old stone walls and shaded forest floors. You set the pot down beside the covered cup of egg oil binder, and you bring out a small flat palette tile that you keep for mixing colors. The tile is a rectangle of smooth white marble, about the size of your hand, its surface polished to a soft gleam, and it has been used so many times that faint stains of old pigments linger in its microscopic pores, a ghostly map of past paintings. You wipe the tile clean with a damp cloth, removing any dust that may have settled there, and you dry it with a corner of linen until it gleams under the lamplight. Now you take up the bone spatula, its tip worn thin and smooth from years of use, and you dip it into the pot of green earth powder. You lift out a small amount of the pigment, a soft pale scoop that sits on the spatula like a tiny hill of dust, and you transfer it to the center of the marble palette tile. The powder settles there in a loose, airy pile, and you repeat the motion twice more, adding 2 more small scoops until you have a quantity about the size of a lentil. You press the pile gently with the flat of the spatula, breaking up any tiny clumps, and the powder spreads slightly, its color a dusty, muted celadon. You set the spatula aside and turn to the covered cup of binder. The slate lid lifts away easily, and you look inside at the golden emulsion you prepared earlier. The mixture of egg yolk, clarified linseed oil, and a drop of vinegar. It has rested quietly under its cover, and its surface is smooth and glossy, with a slight skin forming at the edges where the air has touched it. You stir the binder once with a glass rod, breaking the skin and restoring the emulsion to its uniform, honey-like consistency, and the faint, nutty scent rises into the quiet air. Using the glass rod, you transfer a single drop of the binder to the marble tile, letting it fall beside the pile of green earth pigment. The drop is small and perfect, a tiny amber gold dome that gleams with a warm, oily luster. You add a second drop, then a third, judging the proportions by eye, knowing from long experience that the first layers of an icon must be lean, with less binder, so that the subsequent layers can be richer and more flexible without cracking. You want a thin, translucent paint today, a wash that will barely tint the white gesso and leave it glowing through, like light through a thin cloud. You take up the bone spatula again and begin to mix the pigment and the binder together on the marble tile. You work with a slow, circular motion, pressing the green earth powder into the golden emulsion, folding the two substances together in a patient, repetitive rhythm. At first the powder resists the liquid, remaining in dry, separate clumps that slide across the marble without blending, but you continue the mixing, adding pressure gradually, and slowly the pigment begins to absorb the binder. The green earth darkens as it wets, shifting from a dusty, pale sage to a deeper, richer olive tone, and the binder takes on the color, turning from amber gold to a translucent grayish green. The mixing continues for a long, quiet interval, your wrist moving in its steady circles, the spatula making a soft scraping sound against the marble, and you watch the paint become smooth and uniform, a thin, creamy liquid that flows easily, but is not so thin that it will run. When the paint is fully mixed, you test its consistency by lifting the spatula and watching the stream that drips back onto the tile. The paint falls in a slow, even ribbon that holds its shape for a moment before settling into the pool, and you nod once, a small private acknowledgement that the consistency is right. You set the spatula aside and reach for the squirrel tail brush that you cleaned earlier, its fine bristles coming to a delicate, tapered point. The brush is dry, and you dip it into the water cup, letting the bristles soak up a small amount of moisture. Then you touch it to a scrap of linen to remove the excess, leaving it damp but not wet. You lower the brush to the mixed paint on the palette tile and draw the tip through the edge of the greenish pool, loading the bristles with a small, measured amount of color. The paint clings to the brush in a thin, even film, and you lift it over the panel, pausing for a moment to center your hand and steady your breathing. The lamp flame flickers once, a tiny, gentle flutter, and then it steadies, and you lower the brush to the gessoed surface. You begin painting in the upper left corner of the panel, where the background shadow will one day give way to the golden halo. The brush moves with a light, feathery touch, the bristles barely grazing the gesso, and you lay down a thin, transparent wash of greenish color that spreads in a slow, even film. The stroke is long and smooth, starting at the edge and moving inward with a steady, unhurried motion, and the paint flows off the brush in a controlled, continuous release. The color is so pale and translucent that you can see the white gesso clearly through it, and the dotted charcoal lines beneath remain visible, guiding your hand along the contours of the composition. You lift the brush and reload it, dipping the tit once more into the pool of paint, and you lay down a second stroke that overlaps the first by a tiny, seamless margin. The brushwork is repetitive and methodical, each stroke parallel to the one before it, and your hand moves with the same steady, practiced rhythm that has guided it through countless paintings. The only sounds are the soft, whispering drag of the bristles on the gesso, the faint creak of the wooden handle in your grip, and the steady hiss of the lamp. You work slowly, covering the background area behind the halo with a uniform, pale wash, the color deepening subtly where two strokes overlap, creating a soft atmospheric variation that will give the finished icon its sense of depth. After completing the background, you pause and sit back on the stool, examining your work. The thin wash of green earth has transformed the blank white gesso into a surface that holds a faint, living shadow, a subtle modulation of tone that suggests space and air. The color is so pale that it is almost a breath rather than a paint layer, a mere tint that cools the white and prepares it for the warmer layers to come. The charcoal dots of the transferred drawing still show through clearly, and they will guide the next stages of the painting, the building up of the face and the hands and the folds of the robe. You reload the brush and continue, working your way around the halo and into the spaces between the figure's head and the edge of the panel. The brushstrokes flow outward in a slow radial pattern, following the implied shape of the halo, and the green wash settles into the gesso with a smooth, even absorption, the moisture of the paint sinking into the porous ground and leaving behind a thin, matte film of pigment. You watch the color change as it dries, the wet, darker olive shifting to a paler, softer tone that is almost imperceptible against the white. This is how an icon begins, not with bold, bright colors, but with these quiet, nearly invisible layers that build up slowly over time, each one adding a fraction of depth and luminosity. Now you turn your attention to the figure itself, starting with the shadows of the face. The drawing has marked the areas where the features will emerge, the curve of the brow, the hollow of the eye sockets, the line of the nose, the gentle closed mouth. You load the brush with a slightly more concentrated mix of the green paint, still very thin but carrying a deeper tone, and you begin to lay in the first soft shadows that will define the structure of the face. The brush traces the line beneath the brow with a slow, careful stroke, the color pooling in a delicate, transparent layer that darkens the gesso just enough to suggest depth. You work around the eyes, leaving the dots of the irises untouched, and you shade the sides of the nose with tiny, feathery strokes that blend seamlessly into the surrounding white. The brush moves as if it has a mind of its own, your hand following the guidance of the drawing, your eye checking the proportions and the placement of each shadow. The face begins to emerge from the flat white ground like a reflection appearing on still water, its features soft and tentative, a mere suggestion of what they will become. The green undertone will serve as the base for the warm flesh tones to come, and in the finished icon, these shadows will be invisible, buried under layers of ochre and white and red, but they will give the face its subtle, living depth, the quiet realism that makes the sacred image feel present and watchful. You continue painting the shadows of the robe, working down from the shoulders to the lower edge of the panel. The folds of the garment are indicated by the dotted charcoal lines, and you follow these lines with a steady, flowing stroke, laying down a slightly darker wash that defines the creases and the fall of the fabric. The brush moves in long, smooth curves, the paint spreading in a thin, even film that follows the contours of the drawing, and you pause frequently to reload the brush and to check the consistency of the paint on the palette tile. The color is a cool, muted green, the color of shadows on snow or of moss growing on a north-facing stone, and it will provide the perfect underpainting for the deep reds and warm ochres that will later cover these same folds. Your hand moves with a calm, unhurried assurance, each stroke deliberate and slow, each pause an opportunity to breathe and to observe. The painting is a meditation, a quiet, repetitive activity that fills the hours with a gentle, purposeful rhythm, and you lose yourself in it as you have lost yourself in the grinding and the washing and the preparation of the binder. Time becomes a soft, blurred thing, measured only by the gradual covering of the panel with the pale green wash and the slow lowering of the oil level in the lamp. After a long stretch of painting, you set the brush down and sit back, rolling your shoulders to ease the slight tension that has accumulated there. The panel is now covered with a thin, even layer of greenish shadow, the entire composition visible in soft, muted tones that hover between white and pale olive. The face gazes out with its calm, patient expression, the halo glows with a faint, cool radiance, and the folds of the robe flow downward in a quiet, graceful cascade. The painting is in its earliest stage, a mere whisper of the icon it will become. But even at this stage it holds a presence, a sense of quiet watchfulness that fills the workshop with a subtle, peaceful gravity. You clean the brush in the water cup, swelling the bristles gently to release the green paint, and you watch the water cloud with a faint, pale tint. You dry the brush on a scrap of linen, shaping the bristles back into their fine point, and you set it aside in its holder, a small clay cylinder that protects the delicate tip. The palette tile you wipe clean with a damp cloth, removing the remaining paint, and you dry it and set it back in its place at the back of the bench. The bone spatula you clean as well, wiping it carefully and laying it beside the slab. The covered cup of binder still holds enough emulsion for many more painting sessions, and you press the slate lid down firmly, sealing it against the air. The pot of green earth pigment you close with its wax-sealed lid, and you return it to its place among the other colors. The workspace is tidy now, the tools cleaned and put away, and only the panel remains on the bench, its surface still slightly damp in places where the paint has not fully dried. You take up a clean, loose linen cloth and drape it gently over the panel, creating a small tent-like cover that will protect the wet paint from dust while allowing the moisture to evaporate slowly. The cloth settles over the image like a soft white veil, and the icon disappears beneath it, retreating into a quiet dark space where it will rest until you return to add the next layer. Now the night has reached its deepest hour, and the lamp oil has burned low. You can see the level, through the pale clay of the reservoir, a thin dark line just above the base of the wick, and you know that the flame will soon begin to gutter. You sit for a moment longer on the stool, your hands resting loosely in your lap, your breathing slow and even, and you let the stillness of the workshop wrap around you like a blanket. The distant sound of the sea is still there, a low, eternal murmur, and the high window slit shows a sky that has begun to shift from deep black to a slightly softer shade, the first hint of the dawn that is still far away. At last, you lean forward and pinch the bronze wick pick between your thumb and forefinger, using it to push the wick down into the oil reservoir, cutting off the fuel. The flame flickers once. a brief bright flutter, and then it shrinks to a small blue point that hovers at the tip of the wick for a single lingering moment before extinguishing with a soft, final hiss. The workshop falls into complete darkness, a velvety blackness that is thick and cool and utterly silent. You sit in the dark for a short while, letting your eyes adjust, letting the last of the lamp's warmth fade from your face. The smell of the room is rich and layered, the dry, chalky scent of the gesso, the faint nuttiness of the oil binder, the clean mineral smell of the washed stones, and the thin, smoky trace of the just extinguished wick. It is the smell of a night's work completed, of quiet labor and patient craft, and it fills your lungs with a deep, satisfying calm. You rise from the stool slowly, your legs slightly stiff, and you feel your way to the door by memory and touch, your fingers brushing the cool plaster wall, the edge of the shelf, the rough wood of the door frame. The latch lifts with a soft, metallic click, and you step out into the narrow lane, pulling the door closed behind you. The night air is cool and fresh, carrying the salt tang of the sea and the faint, sweet scent of jasmine from a hidden courtyard, and you pause for a moment to breathe it in, looking up at the stars that still burn bright overhead. The city sleeps around you, its streets empty and quiet, and you walk slowly toward your bed, your body tired in a good, clean way, your mind as still and peaceful as the dark workshop you have left behind.